Chapter 20. The card tables were drawn out, sets made up for Boston and the Count's visitors settled themselves, some in the two drawing rooms, some in the sitting room, some in the library. The Count, holding his cards fanwise, kept himself with difficulty from dropping into his usual after-dinner nap and laughed at everything. The young people, at the Countess' instigation, gathered round the clavichord and harp. Julie by general request played first. After she had played a little air with variations on the harp, she joined the other young ladies in begging Natasha and Nicholas, who were noted for their musical talent, to sing something. Natasha, who was treated as though she were grown up, was evidently very proud of this but at the same time felt shy. "What shall we sing?" she said. "The Brook," suggested Nicholas. "Well, then, let's be quick. Boris, come here," said Natasha. "But where is Sonia?" She looked round and seeing that her friend was not in the room ran to look for her. Running into Sonia's room and not finding her there, Natasha ran to the nursery. But Sonia was not there either. Natasha concluded that she must be on the chest in the passage. The chest in the passage was the place of mourning for the younger female generation in the Rostov household, and there in fact was Sonia lying face downward on nurse's dirty feather bed on the top of the chest, crumpling her gauzy pink dress under her, hiding her face with her slender fingers, and sobbing so convulsively that her bare little shoulders shook. Natasha's face, which had been so radiantly happy all that saint's day, suddenly changed. Her eyes became fixed, and then a shiver passed down her broad neck and the corners of her mouth drooped. "Sonia, what is it? What is the matter?" And Natasha's large mouth widened, making her look quite ugly, and she began to wail like a baby without knowing why, except that Sonia was crying. Sonia tried to lift her head to answer, but could not, and hid her face still deeper in the bed. Natasha wept, sitting on the blue-striped, feathered bed and hugging her friend. With an effort Sonia sat up and began wiping her eyes and explaining. "Nicholas is going away in a week's time. His papers have come, he told me himself, but still I should not cry." And she showed a paper she held in her hand, with the verses Nicholas had written. "Still, I should not cry. But you can't, no one can understand what a soul he has." And she began to cry again, because he had such a noble soul. "It's all very well for you, I am not envious, I love you and Boris. Also," she went on, gaining a little strength, "he is nice, there are no difficulties in your way, but Nicholas is my cousin, one would have to the Metropolitan himself. An evening then it can't be done. And besides, if she tells Mamma Sonia looked upon the Countess as her mother and called her so that I am spoiling Nicholas' career and am heartless and ungrateful, while truly God is my witness," and she made the sign of the cross. "I love her so much, and all of you, only, Vera, and what for? What have I done to her? I am so grateful to you that I would willingly sacrifice everything, only I have nothing." Sonia could not continue, and again hid her face in her hands. And in the feather bed, Natasha began consoling her, but her face showed that she understood all the gravity of her friend's trouble. "Sonia," she suddenly exclaimed, as if she had guessed the true reason of her friend's sorrow, "I'm sure Vera has said something to you since dinner, hasn't she?" "Yes, these verses Nicholas wrote himself and I copied some others, and she found them on my table and said she'd show them to Mamma, and that I was ungrateful and that Mamma would never allow him to marry me, but that he'll marry Julie. You see how he's been with her all day." "Natasha, what have I done to deserve it?" And again she began to sob, more bitterly than before. Natasha lifted her up, hugged her, and, smiling through her tears, began comforting her. "Sonia, don't believe her, darling. Don't believe her. Do you remember how we and Nicholas, all three of us, talked in the sitting room after supper? Why, we settled how everything was to be. I don't quite remember how, but don't you remember that it could all be arranged and how nice it all was? There's Uncle Shinshin's brother has married his first cousin, and we are only second cousins, you know, and Boris says it is quite possible. You know I have told him all about it, and he is so clever and so good," said Natasha. "Don't you cry, Sonia, dear love, darling Sonia," and she kissed her and laughed. "Vera's spiteful, never mind her, and all will come right and she won't say anything to Mama. Nicholas will tell her himself, and he doesn't care at all for Julie." Natasha kissed her on the hair. Sonia sat up. The little kitten brightened, its eyes shone, and it seemed ready to lift its tail, jump down on its soft paws, and begin playing with a ball of worsted as a kitten should. "Do you think so? Really, truly," she said, quickly smoothing her frock and hair. "Really, truly," answered Natasha, pushing in a crisp lock that had strayed from under her friend's plaits. Both laughed. "Well, let's go and sing the brook. Come along. Do you know, that fat Pierre who sat opposite me is so funny," said Natasha, stopping suddenly. "I feel so happy," and she set off at a run along the passage. Sonia, shaking off some down which clung to her and tucking away the verses in the bosom of her dress close to her bony little chest, ran after Natasha down the passage into the sitting room with flushed face and light, joyous steps. At the visitor's request, the young people sang the quartet, the brook, with which everyone was delighted. Then Nicholas sang a song he had just learned. At night time in the moon's fair glow, how sweet, as fancies wander free, to feel that in this world there's one who still is thinking but of you, that while her fingers touch the harp, wafting sweet music o'er the lea, it is for you thus swells her heart, sighing its message out to you. A day or two, then bliss unspoilt, but oh, till then I cannot live. He had not finished the last verse before the young people began to get ready to dance in the large hall, and the sound of the feet and the coughing of the musicians were heard from the gallery. Pierre was sitting in the drawing room where Shinshin had engaged him, as a man recently returned from abroad, in a political conversation in which several others joined but which bored Pierre. When the music began, Natasha came in and walking straight up to Pierre said, laughing and blushing, "Mama told me to ask you to join the dancers." "I am afraid of mixing the figures," Pierre replied, "but if you will be my teacher," and lowering his big arm he offered it to the slender little girl. While the couples were arranging themselves and the musicians tuning up, Pierre sat down with his little partner. Natasha was perfectly happy. She was dancing with a grown-up man who had been abroad. She was sitting in a conspicuous place and talking to him like a grown-up lady. She had a fan in her hand that one of the ladies had given her to hold, assuming quite the pose of a society woman. Heaven knows when and where she had learned it. She talked with her partner, fanning herself and smiling over the fan. "Dear, dear, just look at her," exclaimed the countess as she crossed the ballroom, pointing to Natasha. Natasha blushed and laughed. "Well, really, Mamma, why should you? What is there to be surprised at?" In the amid of the third écossaise there was a clatter of chairs being pushed back in the sitting room, where the Count and Maria Dmitrievna had been playing cards with the majority of the more distinguished and older visitors. They now, stretching themselves after sitting so long and replacing their purses and pocketbooks, entered the ballroom. First came Maria Dmitrievna and the Count, both with merry countenances. The Count, with playful ceremony somewhat in ballet style, offered his bent arm to Maria Dmitrievna. He drew himself up, a smile of debonair gallantry lit up his face, and as soon as the last figure of the écossaise was ended, he clapped his hands to the musicians and shouted up to their gallery, addressing the first violin, "Seaman, do you know the Daniel Cooper?" This was the Count's favorite dance, which he had danced in his youth. Strictly speaking, Daniel Cooper was one figure of the Ingles. "Look at Papa," shouted Natasha to the whole company, and quite forgetting that she was dancing with a grown-up partner, she bent her curly head to her knees and made the whole room ring with her laughter. And truly everybody in the room looked with a smile of pleasure at the jovial old gentleman who, standing beside his tall and stout partner, Maria Dmitrievna, curved his arms, beat time, straightened his shoulders, turned out his toes, tapped gently with his foot, and, by a smile that broadened his round face more and more, prepared the onlookers for what was to follow. As soon as the provocatively gay strains of Daniel Cooper, somewhat resembling those of a merry peasant dance, began to sound, all the doorways of the ballroom were suddenly filled by the domestic serfs, the men on one side and the women on the other, who with beaming faces had come to see their master making merry. "Just look at the master, a regular eagle he is," loudly remarked the nurse as she stood in one of the doorways. The Count danced well and knew it, but his partner could not and did not want to dance well. Her enormous figure stood erect, her powerful arms hanging down. She had handed her reticule to the Countess, and only her stern but handsome face really joined in the dance. What was expressed by the whole of the Count's plump figure in Maria Dmitrievna found expression only in her more and more beaming face and quivering nose. But if the Count, getting more and more into the swing of it, charmed the spectators by the unexpectedness of his adroit maneuvers and the agility with which he capered about on his light feet, Maria Dmitrievna produced no less impression by slight exertions, the least effort to move her shoulders or bend her arms when turning, or stamp her foot, whichever one appreciated in view of her size and habitual severity. The dance grew livelier and livelier. The other couples could not attract a moment's attention to their own evolutions and did not even try to do so. All were watching the Count and Maria Dmitrievna. Natasha kept pulling everyone by sleeve or dress, urging them to look at Papa, though as it was they never took their eyes off the couple. In the intervals of the dance the Count, breathing deeply, waved and shouted to the musicians to play faster, 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 and faster. Lightly, more lightly, and yet more lightly whirled the Count, flying round Maria Dmitrievna, now on his toes, now on his heels, until, turning his partner round to her seat, he executed the final pass, raising his soft foot backwards, bowing his perspiring head, smiling, and making a wide sweep with his arm, amid a thunder of applause and laughter led by Natasha. Both partners stood still, breathing heavily, and wiping their faces with their cambric handkerchiefs. "That's how we used to dance in our time, ma chère," said the Count. Chapter 21. While in the Rostovs' ballroom the sixth anglaise was being danced, to a tune in which the weary musicians blundered, and while tired footmen and cooks were getting the supper, Count Bezukov had a sixth stroke. The doctors pronounced recovery impossible. After a mute confession, communion was administered to the dying man, preparations made for the sacrament of unction, and in his house there was the bustle and thrill of suspense usual at such moments. Outside the house, beyond the gates, a group of undertakers, who hid whenever a carriage drove up, waited in expectation of an important order for an expensive funeral. The military governor of Moscow, who had been assiduous in sending aides de camp to inquire after the Count's health, came himself that evening to bid a last farewell to the celebrated grandee of Catherine's court, Count Bezukov. The magnificent reception room was crowded. Everyone stood up respectfully when the military governor, having stayed about half an hour alone with the dying man, passed out, slightly acknowledging their bows and trying to escape as quickly as possible from the glances fixed on him by the doctors, clergy, and relatives of the family. Prince Vasily, who had grown thinner and paler during the last few days, escorted him to the door, repeating something to him several times in low tones. When the military governor had gone, Prince Vasily sat down all alone on a chair in the ballroom, crossing one leg high over the other, leaning his elbow on his knee and covering his face with his hand. After sitting so for a while he rose, and, looking about him with frightened eyes, went with unusually hurried steps down the long corridor leading to the back of the house, to the room of the eldest princess. Those who were in the dimly lit reception room spoke in nervous whispers, and whenever anyone went into or came from the dying man's room, grew silent and gazed with eyes full of curiosity or expectancy at his door, which creaked slightly when opened. "The limits of human life are fixed and may not be o'erpassed," said an old priest to a lady who had taken a seat beside him and was listening naively to his words. "I wonder, is it not too late to administer unction?" asked the lady, adding the priest's clerical title, as if she had no opinion of her own on the subject. "Ah, madam, it is a great sacrament," replied the priest, passing his hand over the thin grizzled strands of hair combed back across his bald head. Who was that? The military governor himself was being asked at the other side of the room. How young-looking he was. Yes, and he is over 60. I hear the count no longer recognizes anyone. They wished to administer the sacrament of unction. I knew someone who received that sacrament 7 times. The second princess had just come from the sick room with her eyes red from weeping and sat down beside Dr. Lorraine, who was sitting in a graceful pose under a portrait of Catherine, leaning his elbow on a table. "Beautiful," said the doctor in answer to a remark about the weather. "The weather is beautiful, princess, and besides, in Moscow one feels as if one were in the country." "Yes, truly," replied the princess with a sigh. "So he may have something to drink." Lorraine considered. "Has he taken his medicine?" "Yes." The doctor glanced at his watch. "Take a glass of boiled water and put a pinch of cream of tartar," and he indicated with his delicate fingers what he meant by a pinch. "Dara has never been a gaze," a German doctor was saying to an aide-de-camp, "dat one lifts after the third stroke." "And what a well-preserved man he was," remarked the aide-de-camp. "And who will inherit his wealth?" he added in a whisper. "It won't go begging," replied the German with a smile. Everyone again looked toward the door, which creaked as the second princess went in with the drink she had prepared according to Lorraine's instructions. The German doctor went up to Lorraine. "Do you think he can last till morning?" asked the German, addressing Lorraine in French, which he pronounced badly. Lorraine, pursing up his lips, waved a severely negative finger before his nose. "Tonight, not later," said he in a low voice, and he moved away with a decorous smile of self-satisfaction at being able clearly to understand and state the patient's condition. Meanwhile, Prince Vasily had opened the door into the princess' room. In this room it was almost dark. Only 2 tiny lamps were burning before the icons, and there was a pleasant scent of flowers and burnt pastils. The room was crowded with small pieces of furniture, whatnots, cupboards, and little tables. The quilt of a high, white feather bed was just visible behind a screen. A small dog began to bark. "Ah, is it you, cousin?" She rose and smoothed her hair, which was as usual so extremely smooth that it seemed to be made of one piece with her head and covered with varnish. "Has anything happened?" she asked. "I am so terrified." "No, there is no change. I only came to have a talk about business, Kadich," muttered the prince, seating himself wearily on the chair she had just vacated. "You have made the place warm, I must say," he remarked. "Well, sit down. Let's have a talk." Catherine, "I thought perhaps something had happened," she said with her unchanging, stonily severe expression, and sitting down opposite the prince, she prepared to listen. "I wished to get a nap, mon cousin, but I can't." "Well, my dear," said Prince Vasily, taking her hand and bending it downwards as was his habit. It was plain that this referred to much that they both understood without naming. The princess, who had a straight, rigid body abnormally long for her legs, looked directly at Prince Vasily with no sign of emotion in her prominent gray eyes. Then she shook her head and glanced up at the icons with a sigh. This may have been taken as an expression of sorrow and devotion, or of weariness and hope of resting before long. Prince Vasily understood it as an expression of weariness. "And I," he said, "do you think it is easier for me? I am as worn out as a post horse, but still I must have a talk with you, Kadich, a very serious talk." Prince Vasily said no more, and his cheeks began to twitch nervously, now on one side, now on the other, giving his face an unpleasant expression, which was never to be seen on it in a drawing room. His eyes too seemed strange. At one moment they looked impudently sly, and at the next glanced round in alarm. The princess, holding her little dog on her lap with her thin bony hands, looked attentively into Prince Vasily's eyes, evidently resolved not to be the first to break silence, if she had to wait till morning. "Well, you see, my dear princess and cousin, Catherine Semenovna," continued Prince Vasily, returning to his theme, apparently not without an inner struggle. "At such a moment as this one must think of everything. One must think of the future of all of you. I love you all like children of my own, as you know." The princess continued to look at him without moving, and with the same dull expression. "And then, of course, my family has also to be considered," Prince Vasily went on, testily pushing away a little table without looking at her. "You know, Kadich, that we, you three sisters, Mamontov, and my wife, are the Count's only direct heirs. I know how hard it is for you to talk or think of such matters. It is no easier for me, but, my dear, I am getting on for 60 and must be prepared for anything. Do you know I have sent for Pierre?" The Count, pointing to his portrait, definitely demanded that he should be called. Prince Vasily looked questioningly at the princess, but could not make out whether she was considering what he had just said or whether she was simply looking at him. "There is one thing I constantly pray God to grant, mon cousin," she replied, "and it is that he would be merciful to him and would allow his noble soul peacefully to leave this." "Yes, yes, of course," interrupted Prince Vasily impatiently, rubbing his bald head and angrily pulling back toward him the little table that he had pushed away. "But in short, the fact is, you know yourself, that last winter the Count made a will by which he left all his property, not to us his direct heirs, but to Pierre." "He has made wills enough," quietly remarked the princess, "but he cannot leave the estate to Pierre. Pierre is illegitimate." "But, my dear," said Prince Vasily suddenly, clutching the little table and becoming more animated and talking more rapidly, "what if a letter has been written to the Emperor in which the Count asks for Pierre's legitimation? Do you understand that in consideration of the Count's services his request would be granted?" The princess smiled, as people do who think they know more about the subject under discussion than those they are talking with. "I can tell you more," continued Prince Vasily, seizing her hand. "That letter was written, though it was not sent, and the Emperor knew of it. The only question is, has it been destroyed or not? If not, then as soon as all is over," and Prince Vasily sighed to intimate what he meant by the words "all is over," and the Count's papers are opened, the will and letter will be delivered to the Emperor, and the petition will certainly be granted. Pierre will get everything as the legitimate son. "And our share?" asked the princess, smiling ironically, as if anything may happen, only not that. "But, my poor Kadich, it is as clear as daylight. He will then be the legal heir to everything, and you won't get anything. You must know, my dear, whether the will and letter were written, and whether they have been destroyed or not. And if they have somehow been overlooked, you ought to know where they are and must find them, because—" "What next?" the princess interrupted, smiling sardonically and not changing the expression of her eyes. "I am a woman, and you think we are all stupid, but I know this: an illegitimate son cannot inherit that art." Asterisk, she added, as if supposing that this translation of the word would effectively prove to Prince Vasily the invalidity of his contention. Asterisk, a bastard. "Well, really, Kadich, can't you understand? You are so intelligent. How is it you don't see that if the Count has written a letter to the Emperor begging him to recognize Pierre as legitimate, it follows that Pierre will not be Pierre, but will become Count Bezikov, and will then inherit everything under the will. And if the will and letter are not destroyed, then you will have nothing but the consolation of having been dutiful et tout si qui essensut, asterisk that's certain, asterisk and all that follows therefrom. I know the will was made, but I also know that it is invalid. And you, mon cousin, seem to consider me a perfect fool, said the princess with the expression women assume when they suppose they are saying something witty and stinging. My dear Princess Catherine Semenovna, began Prince Vasily impatiently, I came here not to wrangle with you, but to talk about your interests, as with a kinswoman, a good, kind, true relation. And I tell you for the 10th time that if the letter to the Emperor and the will in Pierre's favor are among the Count's papers, then, my dear girl, you and your sisters are not heiresses. If you don't believe me, then believe an expert. I have just been talking to Dmitri Onufrich, the family solicitor, and he says the same. At this a sudden change evidently took place in the princess' ideas. Her thin lips grew white, though her eyes did not change, and her voice, when she began to speak, passed through such transitions as she herself evidently did not expect. That would be a fine thing, said she. I never wanted anything, and I don't now. She pushed the little dog off her lap and smoothed her dress. And this is gratitude. This is recognition for those who have sacrificed everything for his sake, she cried. It's splendid. Fine. I don't want anything, Prince. Yes, but you are not the only one. There are your sisters, replied Prince Vasily. But the princess did not listen to him. Yes, I knew it long ago but had forgotten. I knew that I could expect nothing but meanness, deceit, envy, intrigue, and ingratitude, the blackest ingratitude, in this house. Do you or do you not know where that will is? Insisted Prince Vasily, his cheeks twitching more than ever. Yes, I was a fool. I still believed in people, loved them, and sacrificed myself. But only the base, the vile succeed. I know who has been intriguing. The princess wished to rise, but the prince held her by the hand. She had the air of one who has suddenly lost faith in the whole human race. She gave her companion an angry glance. There is still time, my dear. You must remember, Kadich, that it was all done casually in a moment of anger, of illness, and was afterwards forgotten. Our duty, my dear, is to rectify his mistake, to ease his last moments by not letting him commit this injustice, and not to let him die feeling that he is rendering unhappy those who sacrificed everything for him. Chimed in the princess, who would again have risen had not the prince still held her fast, though he never could appreciate it. No, mon cousin, she added with a sigh, I shall always remember that in this world one must expect no reward, that in this world there is neither honor nor justice. In this world one has to be cunning and cruel. Now come, come, be reasonable. I know your excellent heart. No, I have a wicked heart. I know your heart, repeated the prince. I value your friendship and wish you to have as good an opinion of me. Don't upset yourself, and let us talk sensibly while there is still time, be it a day or be it but an hour. Tell me all you know about the will, and above all where it is. You must know. We will take it at once and show it to the Count. He has, no doubt, forgotten it and will wish to destroy it. You understand that my sole desire is conscientiously to carry out his wishes. That is my only reason for being here. I came simply to help him and you. Now I see it all. I know who has been intriguing. I know, cried the princess. That's not the point, my dear. It's that protege of yours, that sweet Princess Strubitskaya, that Anna Mikhailovna whom I would not take for a housemaid. The infamous, vile woman. Do not let us lose any time. Ah, don't talk to me. Last winter she wheedled herself in here and told the Count such vile, disgraceful things about us, especially about Sophie. I can't repeat them, that it made the Count quite ill and he would not see us for a whole fortnight. I know it was then he wrote this vile, infamous paper, but I thought the thing was invalid. We've got to it at last. Why did you not tell me about it sooner? It's in the inlaid portfolio that he keeps under his pillow, said the princess, ignoring his question. Now I know. Yes, if I have a sin, a great sin, it is hatred of that vile woman, almost shrieked the princess, now quite changed. And what does she come worming herself in here for? But I will give her a piece of my mind. Chapter 22. While these conversations were going on in the reception room and the princess room, a carriage containing Pierre, who had been sent for, and Anna Mikhailovna, who found it necessary to accompany him, was driving into the court of Count Bezukov's house. As the wheels rolled softly over the straw beneath the windows, Anna Mikhailovna, having turned with words of comfort to her companion, realized that he was asleep in his corner and woke him up. Rousing himself, Pierre followed Anna Mikhailovna out of the carriage, and only then began to think of the interview with his dying father which awaited him. He noticed that they had not come to the front entrance but to the back door. While he was getting down from the carriage steps, two men, who looked like tradespeople, ran hurriedly from the entrance and hid in the shadow of the wall. Pausing for a moment, Pierre noticed several other men of the same kind hiding in the shadow of the house on both sides, but neither Anna Mikhailovna nor the footman nor the coachman, who could not help seeing these people, took any notice of them. It seems to be all right, Pierre concluded, and followed Anna Mikhailovna. She hurriedly ascended the narrow, dimly lit stone staircase, calling to Pierre, who was lagging behind, to follow. Though he did not see why it was necessary for him to go to the Count at all, still less why he had to go by the back stairs, yet judging by Anna Mikhailovna's air of assurance and haste, Pierre concluded that it was all absolutely necessary. Halfway up the stairs they were almost knocked over by some men who, carrying pails, came running downstairs, their boots clattering. These men pressed close to the wall to let Pierre and Anna Mikhailovna pass, and did not evince the least surprise at seeing them there. "Is this the way to the princess's apartments?" asked Anna Mikhailovna of one of them. "Yes," replied a footman in a bold, loud voice, as if anything were now permissible. "The door to the left, ma'am." "Perhaps the Count did not ask for me," said Pierre when he reached the landing. "I'd better go to my own room." Anna Mikhailovna paused and waited for him to come up. "Ah, my friend," she said, touching his arm as she had done her son's when speaking to him that afternoon. "Believe me, I suffer no less than you do. But be a man." "But really, hadn't I better go away?" he asked, looking kindly at her over his spectacles. "Ah, my dear friend, forget the wrongs that may have been done you. Think that he is your father, perhaps in the agony of death." She sighed. "I have loved you like a son from the first. Trust yourself to me, Pierre. I shall not forget your interests." Pierre did not understand a word, but the conviction that all this had to be grew stronger, and he meekly followed Anna Mikhailovna, who was already opening a door. This door led into a back anteroom. An old man, a servant of the princess's, sat in a corner knitting a stocking. Pierre had never been in this part of the house, and did not even know of the existence of these rooms. Anna Mikhailovna, addressing a maid who was hurrying past, with a decanter on a tray, as "my dear and my sweet," asked about the princess' health, and then led Pierre along a stone passage. The first door on the left led into the princess's apartments. The maid with the decanter in her haste had not closed the door. Everything in the house was done in haste at that time, and Pierre and Anna Mikhailovna, in passing, instinctively glanced into the room where Prince Vasily and the eldest princess were sitting close together talking. Seeing them pass, Prince Vasily drew back with obvious impatience, while the princess jumped up and with a gesture of desperation slammed the door with all her might. This action was so unlike her usual composure, and the fear depicted on Prince Vasily's face so out of keeping with his dignity, that Pierre stopped and glanced inquiringly over his spectacles at his guide. Anna Mikhailovna evinced no surprise. She only smiled faintly and sighed, as if to say that this was no more than she had expected. "Be a man, my friend. I will look after your interests," said she in reply to his look, and went still faster along the passage. Pierre could not make out what it was all about, and still less what watching over his interests meant, but he decided that all these things had to be. From the passage they went into a large, dimly lit room adjoining the Count's reception room. It was one of those sumptuous but cold apartments known to Pierre only from the front approach. But evening in this room there now stood an empty bath, and water had been spilled on the carpet. They were met by a deacon with a censer and by a servant who passed out on tiptoe without heeding them. They went into the reception room familiar to Pierre, with two Italian windows opening into the conservatory, with its large bust and full-length portrait of Catherine the Great. The same people were still sitting here in almost the same positions as before, whispering to one another. All became silent and turned to look at the pale tear-worn Anna Mikhailovna as she entered, and at the big stout figure of Pierre who, hanging his head, meekly followed her. Anna Mikhailovna's face expressed a consciousness that the decisive moment had arrived. With the air of a practical Petersburg lady she now, keeping Pierre close beside her, entered the room evening more boldly than that afternoon. She felt that as she brought with her the person the dying man wished to see, her own admission was assured. Casting a rapid glance at all those in the room and noticing the Count's confessor there, she glided up to him with a sort of amble, not exactly bowing yet, seeming to grow suddenly smaller, and respectfully received the blessing, first of one and then of another priest. "God be thanked that you are in time," said she to one of the priests. "All we relatives have been in such anxiety. This young man is the Count's son," she added more softly. "What a terrible moment!" Having said this she went up to the doctor. "Dear doctor," said she, "this young man is the Count's son. Is there any hope?" The doctor cast a rapid glance upwards and silently shrugged his shoulders. Anna Mikhailovna, with just the same movement, raised her shoulders and eyes, almost closing the latter, sighed and moved away from the doctor to Pierre. To him, in a particularly respectful and tenderly sad voice, she said, "Trust in his mercy," and pointing out a small sofa for him to sit and wait for her, she went silently toward the door that everyone was watching, and it creaked very slightly as she disappeared behind it. Pierre, having made up his mind to obey his monitress implicitly, moved toward the sofa she had indicated. As soon as Anna Mikhailovna had disappeared, he noticed that the eyes of all in the room turned to him with something more than curiosity and sympathy. He noticed that they whispered to one another, casting significant looks at him with a kind of awe and evening servility. A deference such as he had never before received was shown him. A strange lady, the one who had been talking to the priests, rose and offered him her seat. An aide-de-camp picked up and returned a glove Pierre had dropped. The doctors became respectfully silent as he passed by and moved to make way for him. At first Pierre wished to take another seat so as not to trouble the lady, and also to pick up the glove himself and to pass round the doctors who were not evening in his way, but all at once he felt that this would not do, and that tonight he was a person obliged to perform some sort of awful right which everyone expected of him, and that he was therefore bound to accept their services. He took the glove in silence from the aide-de-camp and sat down in the lady's chair. placing his huge hands symmetrically on his knees in the naive attitude of an Egyptian statue, and decided in his own mind that all was as it should be, and that in order not to lose his head and do foolish things he must not act on his own ideas tonight, but must yield himself up entirely to the will of those who were guiding him. Not 2 minutes had passed before Prince Vasily, with head erect, majestically entered the room. He was wearing his long coat with 3 stars on his breast. He seemed to have grown thinner since the morning. His eyes seemed larger than usual when he glanced round and noticed Pierre. He went up to him, took his hand, a thing he never used to do, and drew it downwards as if wishing to ascertain whether it was firmly fixed on. Courage, courage, my friend. He has asked to see you. That is well. And he turned to go, but Pierre thought it necessary to ask how is, and hesitated not, knowing whether it would be proper to call the dying man the Count, yet ashamed to call him father. He had another stroke about half an hour ago. Courage, my friend. Pierre's mind was in such a confused state that the word stroke suggested to him a blow from something. He looked at Prince Vasily in perplexity, and only later grasped that a stroke was an attack of illness. Prince Vasily said something to Lorraine in passing, and went through the door on tiptoe. He could not walk well on tiptoe, and his whole body jerked at each step. The eldest princess followed him, and the priests and deacons and some servants also went in at the door. Through that door was heard a noise of things being moved about, and at last Anna Mikhailovna, still with the same expression, pale but resolute in the discharge of duty, ran out, and touching Pierre lightly on the arm, said, "The divine mercy is inexhaustible. Unction is about to be administered." Chapter 23. Pierre well knew this large room divided by columns and an arch, its walls hung round with Persian carpets. The part of the room behind the columns, with a high silk-curtained mahogany bedstead on one side and on the other an immense case containing icons, was brightly illuminated with red light like a Russian church during evening service. Under the gleaming icons stood a long invalid chair, and in that chair, on snowy white smooth pillows, evidently freshly changed, Pierre saw, covered to the waist by a bright green quilt, the familiar, majestic figure of his father, Count Bezukov, with that grey mane of hair above his broad forehead which reminded one of a lion, and the deep, characteristically noble wrinkles of his handsome, ruddy face. He lay just under the icons, his large thick hands outside the quilt. Into the right hand, which was lying palm downwards, a wax taper had been thrust between forefinger and thumb, and an old servant, bending over from behind the chair, held it in position. By the chair stood the priests, their long hair falling over their magnificent glittering vestments, with lighted tapers in their hands, slowly and solemnly conducting the service. A little behind them stood the 2 younger princesses, holding handkerchiefs to their eyes, and just in front of them their eldest sister, Kadich, with a vicious and determined look steadily fixed on the icons, as though declaring to all that she could not answer for herself should she glance round. Anna Mikhailovna, with a meek, sorrowful, and all-forgiving expression on her face, stood by the door, near the strange lady. Prince Vasily in front of the door, near the invalid chair, a wax taper in his left hand, was leaning his left arm on the carved back of a velvet chair he had turned round for the purpose, and was crossing himself with his right hand, turning his eyes upward. Each time he touched his forehead, his face wore a calm look of piety and resignation to the will of God. If you do not understand these sentiments, he seemed to be saying, so much the worse for you. Behind him stood the aide-de-camp, the doctors, and the men-servants. The men and women had separated as in church. All were silently crossing themselves, and the reading of the church service, the subdued chanting of deep bass voices, and in the intervals sighs and the shuffling of feet were the only sounds that could be heard. Anna Mikhailovna, with an air of importance that showed that she felt she quite knew what she was about, went across the room to where Pierre was standing and gave him a taper. He lit it and, distracted by observing those around him, began crossing himself with the hand that held the taper. Sophie, the rosy, laughter-loving youngest princess with the mole, watched him. She smiled, hid her face in her handkerchief, and remained with it hidden for a while. Then looking up and seeing Pierre, she again began to laugh. She evidently felt unable to look at him without laughing, but could not resist looking at him, so to be out of temptation she slipped quietly behind one of the columns. In the amid of the service the voices of the priests suddenly ceased. They whispered to one another, and the old servant who was holding the count's hand got up and said something to the ladies. Anna Mikhailovna stepped forward, and, stooping over the dying man, beckoned to Lorraine from behind her. Back, the French doctor held no taper. He was leaning against one of the columns in a respectful attitude, implying that he, a foreigner, in spite of all differences of faith, understood the full importance of the rite now being performed and evening approved of it. He now approached the sick man with the noiseless step of one in full vigor of life, with his delicate white fingers raised from the green quilt the hand that was free, and turning sideways felt the pulse and reflected a moment. The sick man was given something to drink. There was a stir around him. Then the people resumed their places and the service continued. During this interval Pierre noticed that Prince Vasily left the chair on which he had been leaning, and, with an air which intimated that he knew what he was about, and if others did not understand him it was so much the worse for them, did not go up to the dying man, but passed by him, joined the eldest princess, and moved with her to the side of the room where stood the high bedstead with its silken hangings. On leaving the bed both Prince Vasily and the princess passed out by a back door, but returned to their places one after the other before the service was concluded. Pierre paid no more attention to this occurrence than to the rest of what went on, having made up his mind once for all that what he saw happening around him that evening was in some way essential. The chanting of the service ceased, and the voice of the priest was heard respectfully congratulating the dying man on having received the sacrament. The dying man lay as lifeless and immovable as before. Around him everyone began to stir. Steps were audible, and whispers, among which Anna Mikhailovna's was the most distinct. Pierre heard her say, "Certainly he must be moved on to the bed. Here it will be impossible." The sick man was so surrounded by doctors, princesses, and servants that Pierre could no longer see the reddish-yellow face with its gray mane, which, though he saw other faces as well, he had not lost sight of for a single moment during the whole service. He judged by the cautious movements of those who crowded round the invalid chair that they had lifted the dying man and were moving him. "Catch hold of my arm or you'll drop him," he heard one of the servants say in a frightened whisper. "Catch hold from underneath." "Here!" exclaimed different voices, and the heavy breathing of the bearers and the shuffling of their feet grew more hurried, as if the weight they were carrying were too much for them. As the bearers, among whom was Anna Mikhailovna, passed the young man, he caught a momentary glimpse between their heads and backs of the dying man's high, stout, uncovered chest and powerful shoulders raised by those who were holding him under the armpits, and of his gray, curly, leonine head. This head, with its remarkably broad brow and cheekbones, its handsome, sensual mouth, and its cold, majestic expression, was not disfigured by the approach of death. It was the same as Pierre remembered it 3 months before, when the Count had sent him to Petersburg. But now this head was swaying helplessly with the uneven movements of the bearers, and the cold, listless gaze fixed itself upon nothing. After a few minutes' bustle beside the high bedstead, those who had carried the sick man dispersed. Anna Mikhailovna touched Pierre's hand and said, "Come." Pierre went with her to the bed on which the sick man had been laid in a stately pose in keeping with the ceremony just completed. He lay with his head propped high on the pillows. His hands were symmetrically placed on the green silk quilt, the palms downward. When Pierre came up, the Count was gazing straight at him, but with a look the significance of which could not be understood by mortal man. Either this look meant nothing but that as long as one has eyes they must look somewhere, or it meant too much. Pierre hesitated, not knowing what to do, and glanced inquiringly at his guide. Anna Mikhailovna made a hurried sign with her eyes, glancing at the sick man's hand and moving her lips as if to send it a kiss. Pierre, carefully stretching his neck so as not to touch the quilt, followed her suggestion and pressed his lips to the large boned, fleshy hand. Neither the hand nor a single muscle of the Count's face stirred. Once more Pierre looked questioningly at Anna Mikhailovna to see what he was to do next. Anna Mikhailovna with her eyes indicated a chair that stood beside the bed. Pierre obediently sat down, his eyes asking if he were doing right. Anna Mikhailovna nodded approvingly. Again Pierre fell into the naively symmetrical pose of an Egyptian statue, evidently distressed that his stout and clumsy body took up so much room, and doing his utmost to look as small as possible. He looked at the Count, who still gazed at the spot where Pierre's face had been before he sat down. Anna Mikhailovna indicated by her attitude her consciousness of the pathetic importance of these last moments of meeting between the father and son. This lasted about 2 minutes, which to Pierre seemed an hour. Suddenly the broad muscles and lines of the Count's face began to twitch. The twitching increased. The handsome mouth was drawn to one side. Only now did Pierre realize how near death his father was, and from that distorted mouth issued an indistinct, hoarse sound. Anna Mikhailovna looked attentively at the sick man's eyes, trying to guess what he wanted. She pointed first to Pierre, then to some drink, then named Prince Vasily in an inquiring whisper, then pointed to the quilt. The eyes and face of the sick man showed impatience. He made an effort to look at the servant, who stood constantly at the head of the bed. Wants to turn on the other side, whispered the servant, and got up to turn the Count's heavy body toward the wall. Pierre rose to help him. While the Count was being turned over, one of his arms fell back helplessly, and he made a fruitless effort to pull it forward. Whether he noticed the look of terror with which Pierre regarded that lifeless arm, or whether some other thought flitted across his dying brain, at any rate he glanced at the refractory arm, at Pierre's terror-stricken face, and again at the arm, and on his face a feeble, piteous smile appeared, quite out of keeping with his features, that seemed to deride his own helplessness. At sight of this smile Pierre felt an unexpected quivering in his breast and a tickling in his nose, and tears dimmed his eyes. The sick man was turned onto his side with his face to the wall. He sighed. "He is dozing," said Anna Mikhailovna, observing that one of the princesses was coming to take her turn at watching. Chapter 24. There was now no one in the reception room except Prince Vasily and the eldest princess, who were sitting under the portrait of Catherine the Great and talking eagerly. As soon as they saw Pierre and his companion, they became silent, and Pierre thought he saw the princess hide something as she whispered, "I can't bear the sight of that woman." "Kadich has had tea served in the small drawing room," said Prince Vasily to Anna Mikhailovna. "Go and take something, my poor Anna Mikhailovna, or you will not hold out." To Pierre he said nothing, merely giving his arm a sympathetic squeeze below the shoulder. Pierre went with Anna Mikhailovna into the small drawing room. There is nothing so refreshing after a sleepless night as a cup of this delicious Russian tea, Lorraine was saying with an air of restrained animation as he stood sipping tea from a delicate Chinese handleless cup before a table on which tea and a cold supper were laid in the small, circular room. Around the table all who were at Count Bezukov's house that night had gathered to fortify themselves. Pierre well remembered this small circular drawing room with its mirrors and little tables. During balls given at the house, Pierre, who did not know how to dance, had liked sitting in this room to watch the ladies who, as they passed through in their ball dresses with diamonds and pearls on their bare shoulders, looked at themselves in the brilliantly lighted mirrors which repeated their reflections several times. Now this same room was dimly lighted by two candles. On one small table tea things and supper dishes stood in disorder, and in the middle of the night a motley throng of people sat there, not merrymaking, but solemnly whispering, and betraying by every word and movement that they none of them forgot what was happening and what was about to happen in the bedroom. Pierre did not eat anything, though he would very much have liked to. He looked inquiringly at his monitress and saw that she was again going on tiptoe to the reception room where they had left Prince Vasily and the eldest princess. Pierre concluded that this also was essential, and after a short interval followed her. Anna Mikhailovna was standing beside the princess, and they were both speaking in excited whispers. "Permit me, princess, to know what is necessary and what is not necessary," said the younger of the two speakers, evidently in the same state of excitement as when she had slammed the door of her room. "But, my dear princess," answered Anna Mikhailovna blandly but impressively, blocking the way to the bedroom and preventing the other from passing, "won't this be too much for poor uncle at a moment when he needs repose? Worldly conversation at a moment when his soul is already prepared." Prince Vasily was seated in an easy chair in his familiar attitude, with one leg crossed high above the other. His cheeks, which were so flabby that they looked heavier below, were twitching violently, but he wore the air of a man little concerned in what the two ladies were saying. "Come, my dear Anna Mikhailovna, let Kadich do as she pleases. You know how fond the Count is of her." "I don't even know what is in this paper," said the younger of the two ladies, addressing Prince Vasily and pointing to an inlaid portfolio she held in her hand. "All I know is that his real will is in his writing table, and this is a paper he has forgotten." She tried to pass Anna Mikhailovna, but the latter sprang so as to bar her path. "I know, my dear, kind princess," said Anna Mikhailovna, seizing the portfolio so firmly that it was plain she would not let go easily. "Dear princess, I beg and implore you, have some pity on him. Je vous en conjure." The princess did not reply. Their efforts in the struggle for the portfolio were the only sounds audible, but it was evident that if the princess did speak, her words would not be flattering to Anna Mikhailovna. Though the latter held on tenaciously, her voice lost none of its honeyed firmness and softness. "Pierre, my dear, come here. I think he will not be out of place in a family consultation. Is it not so, Prince? Why don't you speak, cousin?" suddenly shrieked the princess so loud that those in the drawing-room heard her and were startled. "Why do you remain silent when heaven knows who permits herself to interfere, making a scene on the very threshold of a dying man's room? Intriguer!" She hissed viciously and tugged with all her might at the portfolio. But Anna Mikhailovna went forward a step or two to keep her hold on the portfolio and changed her grip. Prince Vasily rose. "Oh," said he with reproach and surprise, "this is absurd. Come, let go, I tell you." The princess let go. "And you too." But Anna Mikhailovna did not obey him. "Let go, I tell you. I will take the responsibility. I myself will go and ask him. Does that satisfy you?" "But, Prince," said Anna Mikhailovna, "after such a solemn sacrament, allow him a moment's peace." "Here, Pierre, tell them your opinion," said she, turning to the young man who, having come quite close, was gazing with astonishment at the angry face of the princess, which had lost all dignity, and at the twitching cheeks of Prince Vasily. "Remember that you will answer for the consequences," said Prince Vasily severely. "You don't know what you are doing." "Vile woman!" shouted the princess, darting unexpectedly at Anna Mikhailovna and snatching the portfolio from her. Prince Vasily bent his head and spread out his hands. At this moment that terrible door which Pierre had watched so long, and which had always opened so quietly, burst noisily open and banged against the wall, and the second of the three sisters rushed out, wringing her hands. "What are you doing?" she cried vehemently. "He is dying and you leave me alone with him." Her sister dropped the portfolio. Anna Mikhailovna, stooping, quickly caught up the object of contention and ran into the bedroom. The eldest princess and Prince Vasily, recovering themselves, followed her. A few minutes later the eldest sister came out with a pale hard face, again biting her underlip. At sight of Pierre her expression showed an irrepressible hatred. "Yes, now you may be glad," said she. "This is what you have been waiting for." And bursting into tears she hid her face in her handkerchief and rushed from the room. Prince Vasily came next. He staggered to the sofa on which Pierre was sitting and dropped onto it, covering his face with his hand. Pierre noticed that he was pale and that his jaw quivered and shook as if in an ague. "Ah, my friend," said he, taking Pierre by the elbow, and there was in his voice a sincerity and weakness Pierre had never observed in it before. "How often we sin, how much we deceive, and all for what? I am near 60, dear friend. I too all will end in death. All. Death is awful," and he burst into tears. Anna Mikhailovna came out last. She approached Pierre with slow, quiet steps. "Pierre," she said. Pierre gave her an inquiring look. She kissed the young man on his forehead, wetting him with her tears. Then after a pause she said, "He is no more." Pierre looked at her over his spectacles. "Come, I will go with you. Try to weep. Nothing gives such relief as tears." She led him into the dark drawing room, and Pierre was glad no one could see his face. Anna Mikhailovna left him, and when she returned he was fast asleep with his head on his arm. In the morning Anna Mikhailovna said to Pierre, "Yes, my dear, this is a great loss for us all, not to speak of you. But God will support you. You are young, and are now, I hope, in command of an immense fortune. The will has not yet been opened. I know you well enough to be sure that this will not turn your head, but it imposes duties on you, and you must be a man." Pierre was silent. "Perhaps later on I may tell you, my dear boy, that if I had not been there, God only knows what would have happened. You know, Uncle promised me only the day before yesterday not to forget Boris, but he had no time. I hope, my dear friend, you will carry out your father's wish." Pierre understood nothing of all this, and coloring shyly looked in silence at Princess Anna Mikhailovna. After her talk with Pierre, Anna Mikhailovna returned to the Rostovs and went to bed. On waking in the morning she told the Rostovs and all her acquaintances the details of Count Bezukov's death. She said the Count had died as she would herself wish to die, that his end was not only touching but edifying. As to the last meeting between father and son, it was so touching that she could not think of it without tears, and did not know which had behaved better. During those awful moments, the father who so remembered everything and everybody at last and had spoken such pathetic words to the son, or Pierre, whom it had been pitiful to see, so stricken was he with grief, though he tried hard to hide it in order not to sadden his dying father. It is painful, but it does one good. It uplifts the soul to see such men as the old Count and his worthy son, said she. Chapter 25. At Bald Hills, Prince Nicholas Andreevich Bolkonsky's estate, the arrival of young Prince Andrew and his wife was daily expected, but this expectation did not upset the regular routine of life in the old prince's household. General-in-Chief Prince Nicholas Andreevich, nicknamed in society the King of Prussia ever since the Emperor Paul had exiled him to his country estate, had lived there continuously, with his daughter, Princess Mary, and her companion, Mademoiselle Burian. Though in the new reign he was free to return to the capitals, he still continued to live in the country, remarking that Anyone who wanted to see him could come the 100 miles from Moscow to Bald Hills, while he himself needed no one and nothing. He used to say that there are only two sources of human vice, idleness and superstition, and only two virtues, activity and intelligence. He himself undertook his daughter's education, and to develop these two cardinal virtues in her gave her lessons in algebra and geometry till she was 20, and arranged her life so that her whole time was occupied. He was himself always occupied, writing his memoirs, solving problems in higher mathematics, turning snuff boxes on a lathe, working in the garden, or superintending the building that was always going on at his estate. As regularity is a prime condition facilitating activity, regularity in his household was carried to the highest point of exactitude. He always came to table under precisely the same conditions, and not only at the same hour, but at the same minute. With those about him, from his daughter to his serfs, the prince was sharp and invariably exacting, so that without being a hard-hearted man he inspired such fear and respect as few hard-hearted men would have aroused. Although he was in retirement and had now no influence in political affairs, every high official appointed to the province in which the prince's estate lay considered it his duty to visit him and waited in the lofty antechamber, just as the architect, gardener, or Princess Mary did, till the prince appeared punctually to the appointed hour. Everyone sitting in this antechamber experienced the same feeling of respect and evening fear when the enormously high study door opened and showed the figure of a rather small old man with powdered wig, small withered hands, and bushy gray eyebrows which, when he frowned, sometimes hid the gleam of his shrewd, youthfully glittering eyes. On the morning of the day that the young couple were to arrive, Princess Mary entered the antechamber as usual at the time appointed for the morning greeting, crossing herself with trepidation and repeating a silent prayer. Every morning she came in like that, and every morning prayed that the daily interview may pass off well. An old powdered manservant, who was sitting in the antechamber, rose quietly and said in a whisper, "Please walk in." Through the door came the regular hum of a lathe. The princess timidly opened the door, which moved noiselessly and easily. She paused at the entrance. The prince was working at the lathe, and after glancing round, continued his work. The enormous study was full of things evidently in constant use. The large table covered with books and plans, the tall glass-fronted bookcases with keys in the locks, the high desk for writing while standing up, on which lay an open exercise book, and the lathe with tools laid ready to hand and shavings scattered around, all indicated continuous, varied, and orderly activity. The motion of the small foot, shod in a Tartar boot embroidered with silver, and the firm pressure of the lean, sinewy hand showed that the prince still possessed the tenacious endurance and vigor of hardy old age. After a few more turns of the lathe, he removed his foot from the pedal, wiped his chisel, dropped it into a leather pouch attached to the lathe, and approaching the table, summoned his daughter. He never gave his children a blessing, so he simply held out his bristly cheek as yet unshaven, and, regarding her tenderly and attentively, said severely, "Quite well. All right, then, sit down." He took the exercise book containing lessons in geometry written by himself, and drew up a chair with his foot. "For tomorrow," said he, quickly finding the page and making a scratch from one paragraph to another with his hard nail. The princess bent over the exercise book on the table. "Wait a bit, here's a letter for you," said the old man suddenly, taking a letter addressed in a woman's hand from a bag hanging above the table, onto which he threw it. At the sight of the letter, red patches showed themselves on the princess' face. She took it quickly and bent her head over it. "From Hellas?" asked the prince with a cold smile that showed his still, sound, yellowish teeth. "Yes, it's from Julie," replied the princess with a timid glance and a timid smile. "I'll let 2 more letters pass, but the third I'll read," said the prince sternly. "I'm afraid you write much nonsense." I'll read the third. Read this if you like, father, said the princess, blushing still more, and holding out the letter. The third, I said the third, cried the prince abruptly, pushing the letter away, and leaning his elbows on the table he drew toward him the exercise book containing geometrical figures. Well, madam, he began, stooping over the book close to his daughter, and placing an arm on the back of the chair on which she sat, so that she felt herself surrounded on all sides by the acrid scent of old age and tobacco, which she had known so long. Now, madam, these triangles are equal. Please note that the angle ABC. The princess looked in a scared way at her father's eyes glittering close to her. The red patches on her face came and went, and it was plain that she understood nothing and was so frightened that her fear would prevent her understanding any of her father's further explanations, however clear they may be. Whether it was the teacher's fault or the pupil's, this same thing happened every day. The princess' eyes grew dim. She could not see and could not hear anything, but was only conscious of her stern father's withered face close to her, of his breath and the smell of him, and could think only of how to get away quickly to her own room to make out the problem in peace. The old man was beside himself, moved the chair on which he was sitting noisily, backward and forward, made efforts to control himself and not become vehement, but almost always did become vehement, scolded, and sometimes flung the exercise book away. The princess gave a wrong answer. Well now, isn't she a fool? Shouted the prince, pushing the book aside and turning sharply away. But rising immediately, he paced up and down, lightly touched his daughter's hair and sat down again. He drew up his chair and continued to explain. This won't do, princess. It won't do, said he, when Princess Mary, having taken and closed the exercise book with the next day's lesson, was about to leave. Mathematics are most important, madam. I don't want to have you like our silly ladies. Get used to it and you'll like it. And he patted her cheek. It will drive all the nonsense out of your head. She turned to go, but he stopped her with a gesture and took an uncut book from the high desk. Here is some sort of key to the mysteries that your Helice has sent you. Religious. I don't interfere with anyone's belief. I have looked at it. Take it. Well, now go. Though, he patted her on the shoulder and himself closed the door after her. Princess Mary went back to her room with a sad, scared expression that rarely left her and which made her plain, sickly face yet plainer. She sat down at her writing table, on which stood miniature portraits and which was littered with books and papers. The princess was as untidy as her father was tidy. She put down the geometry book and eagerly broke the seal of her letter. It was from her most intimate friend from childhood, that same Julie Karagina who had been at the Rostovs' name day party. Julie wrote in French, "Dear and precious friend, how terrible and frightful a thing is separation. Though I tell myself that half my life and half my happiness are wrapped up in you, and that in spite of the distance separating us, our hearts are united by indissoluble bonds, my heart rebels against fate, and in spite of the pleasures and distractions around me, I cannot overcome a certain secret sorrow that has been in my heart ever since we parted. Why are we not together as we were last summer, in your big study, on the blue sofa, the confidential sofa? Why cannot I now, as 3 months ago, draw fresh moral strength from your look, so gentle, calm, and penetrating, a look I loved so well and seem to see before me as I write?" Having read thus far, Princess Mary sighed and glanced into the mirror, which stood on her right. It reflected a weak, ungraceful figure and thin face. Her eyes, always sad, now looked with particular hopelessness at her reflection in the glass. She flatters me, thought the princess, turning away and continuing to read. But Julie did not flatter her friend. The princess' eyes, large, deep, and luminous, it seemed as if at times there radiated from them shafts of warm light, were so beautiful that very often, in spite of the plainness of her face, they gave her an attraction more powerful than that of beauty. But the princess never saw the beautiful expression of her own eyes, the look they had when she was not thinking of herself. As with everyone, her face assumed a forced, unnatural expression as soon as she looked in a glass. She went on, reading. All Moscow talks of nothing but war. One of my two brothers is already abroad, the other is with the guards, who are starting on their march to the frontier. Our dear emperor has left Petersburg, and it is thought intends to expose his precious person to the chances of war. God grant that the Corsican monster who is destroying the peace of Europe may be overthrown by the angel whom it has pleased the Almighty, in his goodness, to give us a sovereign. To say nothing of my brothers, this war has deprived me of one of the associations nearest my heart. I mean young Nicholas Rostov, who with his enthusiasm could not bear to remain inactive, and has left the university to join the army. I will confess to you, dear Mary, that in spite of his extreme youth, his departure for the army was a great grief to me. This young man, of whom I spoke to you last summer, is so noble-minded and full of that real youthfulness which one seldom finds nowadays among our old men of 20, and particularly he is so frank and has so much heart. He is so pure and poetic that my relations with him, transient as they were, have been one of the sweetest comforts to my poor heart, which has already suffered so much. Some day I will tell you about our parting, and all that was said then. That is still too fresh. Ah, dear friend, you are happy not to know these poignant joys and sorrows. You are fortunate, for the latter are generally the stronger. I know very well that Count Nicholas is too young ever to be more to me than a friend, but this sweet friendship, this poetic and pure intimacy, were what my heart needed. But enough of this. The chief news about which all Moscow gossips is the death of old Count Bezukov and his inheritance. Fancy, the three princesses have received very little, Prince Vasily nothing, and it is Monsieur Pierre who has inherited all the property and has besides been recognized as legitimate, so that he is now Count Bezukov and possessor of the finest fortune in Russia. It is rumored that Prince Vasily played a very despicable part in this affair, and that he returned to Petersburg quite crestfallen. I confess I understand very little about all these matters of wills and inheritance, but I do know that since this young man, whom we all used to know as plain Monsieur Pierre, has become Count Bezukov and the owner of one of the largest fortunes in Russia, I am much amused to watch the change in the tone and manners of the mammas burdened by marriageable daughters and of the young ladies themselves toward him, though, between you and me, he always seemed to me a poor sort of fellow. As for the past 2 years, people have amused themselves by finding husbands for me, most of whom I don't even know. The matchmaking chronicles of Moscow now speak of me as the future Countess Bezukova, but you will understand that I have no desire for the post. Propos of marriages, do you know that a while ago that universal auntie, Anna Mikhailovna, told me, under the seal of strict secrecy, of a plan of marriage for you? It is neither more nor less than with Prince Vasily's son Anatole, whom they wish to reform by marrying him to someone rich and distinguished, and it is on you that his relations' choice has fallen. I don't know what you will think of it, but I consider it my duty to let you know of it. He is said to be very handsome and a terrible scapegrace. That is all I have been able to find out about him. But enough of gossip. I am at the end of my second sheet of paper, and Mamma has sent for me to go and dine at the Apraxins. Read the mystical book I am sending you. It has an enormous success here, though there are things in it difficult for the feeble human mind to grasp. It is an admirable book, which calms and elevates the soul. Adieu. Give my respects to Monsieur your father, and my compliments to Mademoiselle Bourienne. I embrace you as I love you. Julie. P.S. Let me have news of your brother and his charming little wife. The princess pondered a while with a thoughtful smile, and her luminous eyes lit up so that her face was entirely transformed. Then she suddenly rose and with her heavy tread went up to the table. She took a sheet of paper and her hand moved rapidly over it. This is the reply she wrote, also in French. Dear and precious friend, your letter of the 13th has given me great delight. So you still love me, my romantic Julie? Separation, of which you say so much that is bad, does not seem to have had its usual effect on you. You complain of our separation. What then should I say if I dared complain? I who am deprived of all who are dear to me. Ah, if we had not religion to console us, life would be very sad. Why do you suppose that I should look severely on your affection for that young man? On such matters I am only severe with myself. I understand such feelings in others, and if never having felt them I cannot approve of them, neither do I condemn them. Only it seems to me that Christian love of one's neighbor, love of one's enemy, is worthier, sweeter, and better than the feelings which the beautiful eyes of a young man can inspire in a romantic and loving young girl like yourself. The news of Count Bezukov's death reached us before your letter, and my father was much affected by it. He says the Count was the last representative but one of the great century, and that it is his own turn now, but that he will do all he can to let his turn come as late as possible. God preserve us from that terrible misfortune. I cannot agree with you about Pierre, whom I knew as a child. He always seemed to me to have an excellent heart, and that is the quality I value most in people. As to his inheritance and the part played by Prince Vasily, it is very sad for both. Ah, my dear friend, our divine Saviour's words that it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God are terribly true. I pity Prince Vasily, but am still more sorry for Pierre, so young and burdened with such riches. To what temptations he will be exposed. If I were asked what I desire most on earth, it would be to be poorer than the poorest beggar. 1,000 thanks, dear friend, for the volume you have sent me and which has such success in Moscow. Yet, since you tell me that among some good things it contains others which our weak human understanding cannot grasp, it seems to me rather useless to spend time in reading what is unintelligible and can therefore bear no fruit. I never could understand the fondness some people have for confusing their minds by dwelling on mystical books that merely awaken their doubts and excite their imagination, giving them a bent for exaggeration, quite contrary to Christian simplicity. Let us rather read the epistles and gospels. Let us not seek to penetrate what mysteries they contain. For how can we, miserable sinners that we are, know the terrible and holy secrets of Providence while we remain in this flesh which forms an impenetrable veil between us and the eternal? Let us rather confine ourselves to studying those sublime rules which our divine Savior has left for our guidance here below. Let us try to conform to them and follow them, and let us be persuaded that the less we let our feeble human minds roam, the better we shall please God, who rejects all knowledge that does not come from him, and the less we seek to fathom what he has been pleased to conceal from us, the sooner will he vouchsafe its revelation to us through his divine Spirit. My father has not spoken to me of a suitor, but has only told me that he has received a letter and is expecting a visit from Prince Vasily. In regard to this project of marriage for me, I will tell you, dear sweet friend, that I look on marriage as a divine institution to which we must conform, however painful it may be to me. Should the Almighty lay the duties of wife and mother upon me, I shall try to perform them as faithfully as I can, without disquieting myself by examining my feelings toward him whom he may give me for husband. I have had a letter from my brother, who announces his speedy arrival at Bald Hills with his wife. This pleasure will be but a brief one, however, for he will leave us again to take part in this unhappy war, into which we have been drawn, God knows how or why. Not only where you are at the heart of affairs and of the world is the talk all of war. Evening here amid field work and the calm of nature, which townsfolk consider characteristic of the country, rumors of war are heard and painfully felt. My father talks of nothing but marches and countermarches, things of which I understand nothing, and the day before yesterday during my daily walk through the village I witnessed a heartrending scene. It was a convoy of conscripts enrolled from our people and starting to join the army. You should have seen the state of the mothers, wives, and children of the men who were going and should have heard the sobs. It seems as though mankind has forgotten the laws of its divine Savior, who preached love and forgiveness of injuries, and that men attribute the greatest merit to skill in killing one another. You, dear and kind friend, may our divine Savior and his most holy Mother keep you in their holy and all-powerful care. Mary, you are sending off a letter, Princess. I have already dispatched mine. I have written to my poor mother, said the smiling Mademoiselle Burian rapidly, in her pleasant mellow tones and with guttural R's. She brought into Princess Mary's strenuous, mournful, and gloomy world a quite different atmosphere, careless, light-hearted, and self-satisfied. Princess, I must warn you, she added, lowering her voice and evidently listening to herself with pleasure and speaking with exaggerated grassiment. The prince has been scolding Michael Ivanovich. He is in a very bad humor, very morose. Be prepared. Ah, dear friend, replied Princess Mary, I have asked you never to warn me of the humor my father is in. I do not allow myself to judge him, and would not have others do so. The princess glanced at her watch and, seeing that she was 5 minutes late in starting her practice on the clavichord, went into the sitting room with a look of alarm. Chapter 27. At the appointed hour the prince, powdered and shaven, entered the dining room where his daughter-in-law, Princess Mary, and Mademoiselle Burian were already awaiting him together with his architect, who, by a strange caprice of his employers, was admitted to table, though the position of that insignificant individual was such as could certainly not have caused him to expect that honor. The prince, who generally kept very strictly to social distinctions and rarely admitted evening important government officials to his table, had unexpectedly selected Michael Ivanovich, who always went into a corner to blow his nose on his checked handkerchief to illustrate the theory that all men are equals, and had more than once impressed on his daughter that Michael Ivanovich was not a whit worse than you or I. At dinner the prince usually spoke to the taciturn Michael Ivanovich more often than to anyone else. In the dining room, which like all the rooms in the house was exceedingly lofty, the members of the household and the footman, one behind each chair, stood waiting for the prince to enter. The head butler, napkin on arm, was scanning the setting of the table, making signs to the footman, and anxiously glancing from the clock to the door by which the prince was to enter. Prince Andrew was looking at a large gilt frame, new to him, containing the genealogical tree of the princes Bolkonsky, opposite which hung another such frame with a badly painted portrait, evidently by the hand of the artist belonging to the estate of a ruling prince in a crown, an alleged descendant of Rurik and ancestor of the Bolkonskis. Prince Andrew, looking again at that genealogical tree, shook his head, laughing as a man laughs who looks at a portrait so characteristic of the original as to be amusing. How thoroughly like him that is, he said to Princess Mary, who had come up to him. Princess Mary looked at her brother in surprise. She did not understand what he was laughing at. Everything her father did inspired her with reverence and was beyond question. Everyone has his Achilles heel, continued Prince Andrew. Fancy, with his powerful mind, indulging in such nonsense. Princess Mary could not understand the boldness of her brother's criticism, and was about to reply, when the expected footsteps were heard, coming from the study. The prince walked in quickly and jauntily as was his wont, as if intentionally contrasting the briskness of his manners with the strict formality of his house. At that moment the great clock struck two, and another with a shrill tone joined in from the drawing room. The prince stood still, his lively glittering eyes from under their thick, bushy eyebrows sternly scanned all present and rested on the little princess. She felt, as courtiers do when the Tsar enters, the sensation of fear and respect which the old man inspired in all around him. He stroked her hair, and then patted her awkwardly on the back of her neck. "I'm glad to see you," he said, looking attentively into her eyes, and then quickly went to his place and sat down. "Sit down, sit down, sit down, Michael Yanovitch." He indicated a place beside him to his daughter-in-law. A footman moved the chair for her. "Ho, ho," said the old man, casting his eyes on her rounded figure. "You've been in a hurry, that's bad." He laughed in his usual dry, cold, and pleasant way, with his lips only, and not with his eyes. "You must walk as much as possible, he said. The little princess did not wish to hear his words. She was silent and seemed confused. The prince asked her about her father, and she began to smile and talk. He asked about mutual acquaintances, and she became still more animated and chattered away, giving him greetings from various people and retailing the town gossip. Countess Apraxina, poor thing, has lost her husband and she has cried her eyes out, she said, growing more and more lively. As she became animated, the prince looked at her more and more sternly, and suddenly, as if he had studied her sufficiently and had formed a definite idea of her, he turned away and addressed Michael Ivanovitch. "Well, Michael Ivanovitch, our Bonaparte will be having a bad time of it." Prince Andrew, he always spoke thus of his son, has been telling me what forces are being collected against him, while you and I never thought much of him. Michael Ivanovitch did not at all know when you and I had said such things about Bonaparte, but understanding that he was wanted as a peg on which to hang the prince's favorite topic, he looked inquiringly at the young prince, wondering what would follow. "He is a great tactician," said the prince to his son, pointing to the architect. And the conversation again turned on the war, on Bonaparte, and the generals and statesmen of the day. The old prince seemed convinced not only that all the men of the day were mere babies who did not know the ABC of war or of politics, and that Bonaparte was an insignificant little Frenchie, successful only because there were no longer any Potemkins or Suvorovs left to oppose him, but he was also convinced that there were no political difficulties in Europe and no real war, but only a sort of puppet show at which the men of the day were playing, pretending to do something real. Prince Andrew gaily bore with his father's ridicule of the new men, and drew him on and listened to him with evident pleasure. "The past always seems good," said he, but did not Suvorov himself fall into a trap Morow set him, and from which he did not know how to escape? "Who told you that?" "Who?" cried the prince. "Suvorov." And he jerked away his plate, which Tikhon briskly caught. "Suvorov. Consider, Prince Andrew, to Frederick and Suvorov. Morow would have been a prisoner if Suvorov had had a free hand, but he had the Hofkriegswurstschnapsrath on his hands. It would have puzzled the devil himself. When you get there you'll find out what those Hofkriegswurstraths are. Suvorov couldn't manage them, so what chance has Michael Kutuzov? No, my dear boy," he continued, "you and your generals won't get on against Buonaparte. You'll have to call in the French, so that birds of a feather may fight together. The German, Pollen, has been sent to New York in America to fetch the Frenchman, Morow," he said, alluding to the invitation made that year to Morow to enter the Russian service. "Wonderful. Were the Potemkins, Suvorovs, and Orlovs Germans? No, lad, either you fellows have all lost your wits, or I have outlived mine. May God help you, but we'll see what will happen." Buonaparte has become a great commander among them. I don't at all say that all the plans are good, said Prince Andrew. I am only surprised at your opinion of Bonaparte. You may laugh as much as you like, but all the same Bonaparte is a great general. Michael Ivanovich, cried the old prince to the architect who, busy with his roast meat, hoped he had been forgotten. Didn't I tell you Buonaparte was a great tactician? Here, he says the same thing, to be sure, your excellency, replied the architect. The prince again laughed his frigid laugh. Buonaparte was born with a silver spoon in his mouth. He has got splendid soldiers. Besides, he began by attacking Germans, and only others have failed to beat the Germans. Since the world began, everybody has beaten the Germans. They beat no one except one another. He made his reputation fighting them, and the prince began explaining all the blunders which, according to him, Bonaparte had made in his campaigns an evening in politics. His son made no rejoinder, but it was evident that whatever arguments were presented he was as little able as his father to change his opinion. He listened, refraining from a reply, and involuntarily wondered how this old man, living alone in the country for so many years, could know and discuss so minutely and acutely all the recent European military and political events. You think I'm an old man and don't understand the present state of affairs, concluded his father. But it troubles me. I don't sleep at night. Come now, where has this great commander of yours shown his skill? He concluded. That would take too long to tell, answered the son. Well, then go to your Buonaparte. Mademoiselle Bourienne, here's another admirer of that powder monkey emperor of yours, he exclaimed in excellent French. You know, Prince, I'm not a Bonapartist. De Saint Quandriviendra hummed the prince out of tune, and, with a laugh still more so, he quitted the table. The little princess, during the whole discussion, and the rest of the dinner sat silent, glancing with a frightened look now at her father-in-law and now at Princess Mary. When they left the table she took her sister-in-law's arm and drew her into another room. Chapter 28. Prince Andrew was to leave next evening. The old prince, not altering his routine, retired as usual after dinner. The little princess was in her sister-in-law's room. Prince Andrew, in a traveling coat without epaulettes, had been packing with his valet in the rooms assigned to him. After inspecting the carriage himself and seeing the trunks put in, he ordered the horses to be harnessed. Only those things he always kept with him remained in his room: a small box, a large canteen fitted with silver plate, 2 Turkish pistols and a saber, a present from his father who had brought it from the siege of Ochakov. All these traveling effects of Prince Andrew's were in very good order, new, clean, and in cloth covers carefully tied with tapes. When starting on a journey or changing their mode of life, men capable of reflection are generally in a serious frame of mind. At such moments, one reviews the past and plans for the future. Prince Andrew's face looked very thoughtful and tender. With his hands behind him he paced briskly from corner to corner of the room, looking straight before him and thoughtfully shaking his head. Did he fear going to the war, or was he sad at leaving his wife? Perhaps both, but evidently he did not wish to be seen in that mood, for hearing footsteps in the passage he hurriedly unclasped his hands, stopped at a table as if tying the cover of the small box, and assumed his usual tranquil and impenetrable expression. It was the heavy tread of Princess Mary that he heard. I hear you have given orders to harness, she cried, panting. She had, apparently, been running, and I did so wish to have another talk with you alone. God knows how long we may again be parted. You are not angry with me for coming. You have changed so, Andrusha, she added, as if to explain such a question. She smiled as she uttered his pet name, Andrusha. It was obviously strange to her to think that this stern handsome man should be Andrusha, the slender, mischievous boy who had been her playfellow in childhood. And where is Lies? He asked, answering her question only by a smile. She was so tired that she has fallen asleep on the sofa in my room. Oh, Andrew, what a treasure of a wife you have, said she, sitting down on the sofa, facing her brother. She is quite a child, such a dear, merry child. I have grown so fond of her. Prince Andrew was silent, but the princess noticed the ironical and contemptuous look that showed itself on his face. One must be indulgent to little weaknesses. Who is free from them? Andrew? Don't forget that she has grown up and been educated in society, and so her position now is not a rosy one. We should enter into everyone's situation. Tout comprender, say tout pardoner. Asterisk think what it must be for her, poor thing, after what she has been used to be parted from her husband and be left alone in the country, in her condition. It's very hard. Asterisk to understand all is to forgive all. Prince Andrew smiled as he looked at his sister, as we smile at those we think we thoroughly understand. You live in the country and don't think the life terrible, he replied. That's different. Why speak of me? I don't want any other life, and can't, for I know no other. But think, Andrew, for a young society woman to be buried in the country during the best years of her life, all alone, for papa is always busy, and well, you know what poor resources I have for entertaining a woman used to the best society. There is only Mademoiselle Burian. I don't like your Mademoiselle Burian at all, said Prince Andrew. No, she is very nice and kind, and above all, she's much to be pitied. She has no one, to tell the truth. I don't need her, and she's evening in my way. You know I always was a savage, and now am evening more. So, I like being alone. Father likes her very much. She and Michael Ivanovich are the two people to whom he is always gentle and kind, because he has been a benefactor to them both. As Sterne says, we don't love people so much for the good they have done us as for the good we have done them. Father took her when she was homeless after losing her own father. She is very good-natured, and my father likes her way of reading. She reads to him in the evenings and reads splendidly. To be quite frank, Mary, I expect father's character sometimes makes things trying for you, doesn't it? Prince Andrew asked suddenly. Princess Mary was first surprised and then aghast at this question. For me, trying for me, said she. He always was rather harsh, and now I should think he's getting very trying, said Prince Andrew, apparently speaking lightly of their father, in order to puzzle or test his sister. You are good in every way, Andrew, but you have a kind of intellectual pride, said the princess, following the train of her own thoughts, rather than the trend of the conversation, and that's a great sin. How can one judge, father? But evening if one may. What feeling except veneration could such a man as my father evoke? And I am so contented and happy with him. I only wish you were all as happy as I am. Her brother shook his head incredulously. The only thing that is hard for me, I will tell you the truth, Andrew's father's way of treating religious subjects. I don't understand how a man of his immense intellect can fail to see what is as clear as day and can go so far astray. That is the only thing that makes me unhappy. But evening in this I can see lately a shade of improvement. His satire has been less bitter of late, and there was a monk he received and had a long talk with. Ah, my dear, I'm afraid you and your monk are wasting your powder, said Prince Andrew banteringly yet tenderly. Ah, mon ami, I only pray and hope that God will hear me. Andrew, she said timidly after a moment's silence, I have a great favor to ask of you. What is it, dear? No, promise that you will not refuse. It will give you no trouble, and is nothing unworthy of you, but it will comfort me. Promise, Andrasha, said she, putting her hand in her reticule but not yet taking out what she was holding inside it, as if what she held were the subject of her request and must not be shown before the request was granted. She looked timidly at her brother. Evening, if it were a great deal of trouble, answered Prince Andrew, as if guessing what it was about. Think what you please. I know you are just like father. Think as you please, but do this for my sake. Please do. Father's father, our grandfather, wore it in all his wars. She still did not take out what she was holding in her reticule. So you promise? Of course. What is it? Andrew, I bless you with this icon and you must promise me you will never take it off. Do you promise? If it does not weigh 100 weight and won't break my neck. To please you, said Prince Andrew. But immediately, noticing the pain expression his joke had brought to his sister's face, he repented and added, I am glad, really, dear, I am very glad. Against your will he will save and have mercy on you and bring you to himself, for in him alone is truth and peace, said she in a voice trembling with emotion, solemnly holding up in both hands before her brother a small, oval, antique, dark-faced icon of the Savior in a gold setting on a finely wrought silver chain. She crossed herself, kissed the icon, and handed it to Andrew. Please, Andrew, for my sake. Rays of gentle light shone from her large, timid eyes. Those eyes lit up the whole of her thin, sickly face and made it beautiful. Her brother would have taken the icon, but she stopped him. Andrew understood, crossed himself and kissed the icon. There was a look of tenderness, for he was touched, but also a gleam of irony on his face. Thank you, my dear. She kissed him on the forehead and sat down again on the sofa. They were silent for a while. As I was saying to you, Andrew, be kind and generous as you always used to be. Don't judge lies harshly, she began. She is so sweet, so good-natured, and her position now is a very hard one. I do not think I have complained of my wife to you, Masha, or blamed her. Why do you say all this to me? Red patches appeared on Princess Mary's face and she was silent as if she felt guilty. I have said nothing to you, but you have already been talked to. And I am sorry for that, he went on. The patches grew deeper on her forehead, neck, and cheeks. She tried to say something but could not. Her brother had guessed right. The little princess had been crying after dinner and had spoken of her forebodings about her confinement and how she dreaded it, and had complained of her fate, her father-in-law, and her husband. After crying, she had fallen asleep. Prince Andrew felt sorry for his sister. Know this, Masha. I can't reproach, have not reproached, and never shall reproach my wife with anything, and I cannot reproach myself with anything in regard to her, and that always will be so in whatever circumstances I may be placed. But if you want to know the truth, if you want to know whether I am happy, no. Is she happy? No. But why this is so I don't know. As he said this he rose, went to his sister, and, stooping, kissed her forehead. His fine eyes lit up with a thoughtful, kindly, and unaccustomed brightness, but he was looking not at his sister but over her head toward the darkness of the open doorway. Let us go to her. I must say good-bye, or go and wake and I'll come in a moment. Petrushka, he called to his valet, come here, take these away, put this on the seat and this to the right. Princess Mary rose and moved to the door, then stopped and said, Andrew, if you had faith you would have turned to God and asked him to give you the love you do not feel, and your prayer would have been answered. Well, may be, said Prince Andrew. Go, Masha, I'll come immediately. On the way to his sister's room, in the passage which connected one wing with the other, Prince Andrew met Mademoiselle Bourienne smiling sweetly. It was the third time that day that, with an ecstatic and artless smile, she had met him in secluded passages. Oh, I thought you were in your room, she said, for some reason, blushing and dropping her eyes. Prince Andrew looked sternly at her, and an expression of anger suddenly came over his face. He said nothing to her, but looked at her forehead and hair, without looking at her eyes, with such contempt that the Frenchwoman blushed and went away without a word. When he reached his sister's room, his wife was already awake, and her merry voice, hurrying one word after another, came through the open door. She was speaking as usual in French, and as if after long self-restraint she wished to make up for lost time. No, but imagine the old Countess Subova, with false curls and her mouth full of false tests, as if she were trying to cheat old age. Ha, ha, ha. Mary, this very sentence about Countess Subova and this same laugh Prince Andrew had already heard from his wife in the presence of others some 5 times. He entered the room softly. The little princess, plump and rosy, was sitting in an easy chair with her work in her hands, talking incessantly, repeating Petersburg reminiscences and evening phrases. Prince Andrew came up, stroked her hair, and asked if she felt rested after their journey. She answered him and continued her chatter. The coach with 6 horses was waiting at the porch. It was an autumn night, so dark that the coachman could not see the carriage pull. Servants with lanterns were bustling about in the porch. The immense house was brilliant with lights shining through its lofty windows. The domestic serfs were crowding in the hall, waiting to bid goodbye to the young prince. The members of the household were all gathered in the reception hall: Michael Ivanovich, Mademoiselle Burian, Princess Mary, and the little princess. Prince Andrew had been called to his father's study as the latter wished to say goodbye to him alone. All were waiting for them to come out. When Prince Andrew entered the study, the old man, in his old age, spectacles and white dressing gown, in which he received no one but his son, sat at the table writing. He glanced round. Going? And he went on writing. I've come to say goodbye. Kiss me here, and he touched his cheek. Thanks, thanks. What do you thank me for? For not dilly-dallying and not hanging to a woman's apron strings. The service before everything. Thanks, thanks. And he went on writing so that his quill spluttered and squeaked. If you have anything to say, say it. These 2 things can be done together, he added. About my wife I am ashamed as it is to leave her on your hands. Why talk nonsense? Say what you want. When her confinement is due, send to Moscow for an accoucheur. Let him be here. The old prince stopped writing and, as if not understanding, fixed his stern eyes on his son. I know that no one can help if nature does not do her work, said Prince Andrew, evidently confused. I know that out of a million cases, only one goes wrong, but it is her fancy and mine. They have been telling her things. She has had a dream and is frightened. HMHM, muttered the old prince to himself, finishing what he was writing. I'll do it. He signed with a flourish, and suddenly turning to his son began to laugh. It's a bad business, eh? What is bad, father? The wife, said the old prince briefly and significantly. I don't understand, said Prince Andrew. No, it can't be helped, lad, said the prince. They're all like that. One can't unmarry. Don't be afraid. I won't tell anyone, but you know it yourself. He seized his son by the hand with small bony fingers, shook it, looked straight into his son's face with keen eyes which seemed to see through him, and again laughed his frigid laugh. The son sighed, thus admitting that his father had understood him. The old man continued to fold and seal his letter, snatching up and throwing down the wax, the seal, and the paper with his accustomed rapidity. What's to be done? She's pretty. I will do everything. Make your mind easy, said he in abrupt sentences while sealing his letter. Andrew did not speak. He was both pleased and displeased that his father understood him. The old man got up and gave the letter to his son. Listen, said he. Don't worry about your wife. What can be done shall be. Now listen. Give this letter to Michael Ilarianovich. I have written that he should make use of you in proper places and not keep you long as an adjutant, a bad position. Tell him I remember and like him. Write and tell me how he receives you. If he is all right, serve him. Nicholas Bolkonsky's son need not serve under anyone if he is in disfavor. Now come here. Asterisk Kutuzov. He spoke so rapidly that he did not finish half his words, but his son was accustomed to understand him. He led him to the desk, raised the lid, drew out a drawer, and took out an exercise book filled with his bold, tall, close handwriting. I shall probably die before you, so remember, these are my memoirs. Hand them to the emperor after my death. Now here is a Lombard bond and a letter. It is a premium for the man who writes a history of Suvorov's wars. Send it to the academy. Here are some jottings for you to read. When I am gone, you will find them useful. Andrew did not tell his father that he would no doubt live a long time. Yet, he felt that he must not say it. I will do it all, father, he said. Well, now, goodbye. He gave his son his hand to kiss and embraced him. Remember this, Prince Andrew. If they kill you, it will hurt me. Your old father. He paused unexpectedly, and then in a querulous voice suddenly shrieked. But if I hear that you have not behaved like a son of Nicholas Bolkonsky, I shall be ashamed. You need not have said that to me, father, said the son with a smile. The old man was silent. I also wanted to ask you, continued Prince Andrew, if I'm killed, and if I have a son, do not let him be taken away from you, as I said yesterday. Let him grow up with you, please. Not let the wife have him, said the old man, and laughed. They stood silent, facing one another. The old man's sharp eyes were fixed straight on his son's. Something twitched in the lower part of the old prince's face. We've said goodbye. Go, he suddenly shouted in a loud, angry voice, opening his door. What is it? What? Asked both princesses when they saw for a moment at the door Prince Andrew and the figure of the old man in a white dressing gown, spectacled and wigless, shouting in an angry voice. Prince Andrew sighed and made no reply. Well, he said, turning to his wife, and this, well, sounded coldly ironic, as if he were saying, now go through your performance. Andrew, already, said the little princess, turning pale and looking with dismay at her husband. He embraced her. She screamed and fell unconscious on his shoulder. He cautiously released the shoulder she leaned on, looked into her face, and carefully placed her in an easy chair. Adieu, Mary, said he gently to his sister, taking her by the hand and kissing her, and then he left the room with rapid steps. The little princess lay in the armchair, Mademoiselle Burian chafing her temples. Princess Mary, supporting her sister-in-law, still looked, with her beautiful eyes full of tears, at the door through which Prince Andrew had gone and made the sign of the cross in his direction. From the study, like pistol shots, came the frequent sound of the old man angrily blowing his nose. Hardly had Prince Andrew gone, when the study door opened quickly, and the stern figure of the old man in the white dressing gown looked out. Gone. Chapter 1. In October 1805, a Russian army was occupying the villages and towns of the Archduchy of Austria, and yet other regiments freshly arriving from Russia were settling near the fortress of Braunau and burdening the inhabitants on whom they were quartered. Braunau was the headquarters of the commander-in-chief, Kutuzov. On October 11, 1805, one of the infantry regiments that had just reached Braunau had halted half a mile from the town, waiting to be inspected by the commander-in-chief. Despite the un-Russian appearance of the locality and surroundings, fruit gardens, stone fences, tiled roofs, and hills in the distance, and despite the fact that the inhabitants who gazed with curiosity at the soldiers were not Russians, the regiment had just the appearance of any Russian regiment preparing for an inspection anywhere in the heart of Russia. On the evening of the last day's march, an order had been received that the commander-in-chief would inspect the regiment on the march. Though the words of the order were not clear to the regimental commander, and the question arose whether the troops were to be in marching order or not, it was decided at a consultation between the battalion commanders to present the regiment in parade order on the principle that it is always better to bow too low than not bow low enough. So the soldiers, after a 20-mile march, were kept mending and cleaning all night long, without closing their eyes, while the adjutants and company commanders calculated and reckoned, and by morning the regiment, instead of the straggling, disorderly crowd it had been on its last march the day before, presented a well-ordered array of 2,000 men, each of whom knew his place and his duty, had every button and every strap in place, and shone with cleanliness. And not only externally was all in order, but had it pleased the commander-in-chief to look under the uniforms, he would have found on every man a clean shirt, and in every knapsack the appointed number of articles, all soap and all, as the soldiers say. There was only one circumstance concerning which no one could be at ease. It was the state of the soldiers' boots. More than half the men's boots were in holes, but this defect was not due to any fault of the regimental commander, for in spite of repeated demands, boots had not been issued by the Austrian commissariat, and the regiment had marched some 700 miles. The commander of the regiment was an elderly, choleric, stout, and thick-set general with grizzled eyebrows and whiskers, and wider from chest to back than across the shoulders. He had on a brand new uniform, showing the creases where it had been folded, and thick gold epaulets, which seemed to stand rather than lie down on his massive shoulders. He had the air of a man happily performing one of the most solemn duties of his life. He walked about in front of the line, and at every step pulled himself up, slightly arching his back. It was plain that the commander admired his regiment, rejoiced in it, and that his whole mind was engrossed by it. Yet his strut seemed to indicate that, besides military matters, social interests and the fair sex occupied no small part of his thoughts. "Well, Michael Mitrich, sir," he said, addressing one of the battalion commanders, who smilingly pressed forward. It was plain that they both felt happy. "We had our hands full last night. However, I think the regiment is not a bad one, eh?" The battalion commander perceived the jovial irony and laughed. "It would not be turned off the field evening on the Tsaritsyn meadow." "What?" asked the commander. At that moment, on the road from the town on which signalers had been posted, two men appeared on horseback. They were an aide-de-camp, followed by a Cossack. The aide-de-camp was sent to confirm the order which had not been clearly worded the day before, namely, that the commander-in-chief wished to see the regiment just in the state in which it had been on the march, in their greatcoats and packs, and without any preparation whatever. A member of the Hofkriegsrath from Vienna had come to Kutuzov the day before with proposals and demands for him to join up with the army of the Archduke Ferdinand and Mack, and Kutuzov, not considering this junction advisable, meant, among other arguments in support of his view, to show the Austrian general the wretched state in which the troops arrived from Russia. With this object he intended to meet the regiment, so the worse the condition it was in, the better pleased the commander-in-chief would be. Though the aide-de-camp did not know these circumstances, he nevertheless delivered the definite order that the men should be in their greatcoats and in marching order, and that the commander-in-chief would otherwise be dissatisfied. On hearing this, the regimental commander hung his head, silently shrugged his shoulders, and spread out his arms with a choleric gesture. "A fine mess we've made of it," he remarked. "There now, didn't I tell you, Michael Mitrich, that if it was said, on the march it meant in greatcoats?" said he reproachfully to the battalion commander. "Oh, my God," he added, stepping resolutely forward. "Company commanders," he shouted in a voice accustomed to command, "sergeants major, how soon will he be here?" he asked the aide-de-camp with a respectful politeness evidently relating to the personage he was referring to. In an hour's time, I should say. Shall we have time to change clothes? I don't know, General. The regimental commander, going up to the line himself, ordered the soldiers to change into their greatcoats. The company commanders ran off to their companies. The sergeants major began bustling. The greatcoats were not in very good condition, and instantly the squares that had up to then been in regular order and silent began to sway and stretch and hum with voices. On all sides soldiers were running to and fro, throwing up their knapsacks with a jerk of their shoulders and pulling the straps over their heads and strapping their overcoats and drawing the sleeves on with upraised arms. In half an hour all was again in order, only the squares had become gray instead of black. The regimental commander walked with his jerky steps to the front of the regiment and examined it from a distance. "Whatever is this? This?" he shouted and stood still. "Commander of the 3rd Company. Commander of the 3rd Company wanted by the general. Commander to the general. 3rd Company to the commander." The words passed along the lines, and an adjutant ran to look for the missing officer. When the eager but misrepeated words had reached their destination in a cry of "the general to the 3rd Company," the missing officer appeared from behind his company and, though he was a middle-aged man and not in the habit of running, trotted awkwardly, stumbling on his toes toward the general. The captain's face showed the uneasiness of a schoolboy who is told to repeat a lesson he has not learned. Spots appeared on his nose, the redness of which was evidently due to intemperance, and his mouth twitched nervously. The general looked the captain up and down as he came up panting, slackening his pace as he approached. "You will soon be dressing your men in petticoats." "What is this?" shouted the regimental commander, thrusting forward his jaw and pointing at a soldier in the ranks of the 3rd Company in a greatcoat of bluish cloth, which contrasted with the others. "What have you been after? The commander-in-chief is expected and you leave your place." "I'll teach you to dress the men in fancy coats for a parade." The commander of the company, with his eyes fixed on his superior, pressed 2 fingers more and more rigidly to his cap, as if in this pressure lay his only hope of salvation. "Well, why don't you speak? Whom have you got there dressed up as a Hungarian?" said the commander with an austere jibe. "Your Excellency." "Well, Your Excellency, what? Your Excellency. But what about Your Excellency? Nobody knows. Your Excellency, it's the officer Dolokhov, who has been reduced to the ranks," said the captain softly. "Well, has he been degraded into a field marshal or into a soldier?" A soldier. He should be dressed in regulation uniform like the others." "Your Excellency, you gave him leave yourself, on the march." "Gave him leave? Leave? That's just like you young men," said the regimental commander, cooling down a little. "Leave truly. One says a word to you and you what?" he added with renewed irritation. "I beg you to dress your men decently." And the commander, turning to look at the adjutant, directed his jerky steps down the line. He was evidently pleased at his own display of anger, and walking up to the regiment wished to find a further excuse for wrath, having snapped at an officer for an unpolished badge, at another, because his line was not straight. He reached the 3rd Company. "How are you standing? Where's your leg?" "Your leg?" shouted the commander with a tone of suffering in his voice, while there were still 5 men between him and Dolokhov with his bluish-gray uniform. Dolokhov slowly straightened his bent knee, looking straight with his clear, insolent eyes in the general's face. "Why a blue coat? Off with it, sergeant major." "Change his coat." The Razi did not finish. "General, I must obey orders, but I'm not bound to endure." Dolokhov hurriedly interrupted. "No talking in the ranks. No talking, no talking. Not bound to endure insults," Dolokhov concluded in loud, ringing tones. The eyes of the general and the soldier met. The general became silent, angrily pulling down his tight scarf. Chapter 2. "He's coming," shouted the signaller at that moment. The regimental commander, flushing, ran to his horse, seized the stirrup, with trembling hands, threw his body across the saddle, righted himself, drew his saber, and with a happy and resolute countenance, opening his mouth awry, prepared to shout. The regiment fluttered like a bird, preening its plumage, and became motionless. Athentilon, shouted the regimental commander in a soul-shaking voice, which expressed joy for himself, severity for the regiment, and welcome for the approaching chief. Along the broad country road, edged on both sides by trees, came a high, light blue Viennese caloche, slightly creaking on its springs and drawn by 6 horses at a smart trot. Behind the caloche galloped the suite and a convoy of Croats. Beside Kutuzov sat an Austrian general, in a white uniform that looked strange among the Russian black ones. The caloche stopped in front of the regiment. Kutuzov and the Austrian general were talking in low voices, and Kutuzov smiled slightly as, treading heavily, he stepped down from the carriage, just as if those 2,000 men, breathlessly gazing at him and the regimental commander, did not exist. The word of command rang out, and again the regiment quivered as with a jingling sound it presented arms. Then, amidst a dead silence, the feeble voice of the commander-in-chief was heard. The regiment roared, "Health to your Excellency," and again all became silent. First Kutuzov stood still while the regiment moved. Then he and the general in white, accompanied by the suite, walked between the ranks. From the way the regimental commander saluted the commander-in-chief and devoured him with his eyes, drawing himself up obsequiously, and from the way he walked through the ranks behind the generals, bending forward, and hardly able to restrain his jerky movements, and from the way he darted forward at every word or gesture of the commander-in-chief, it was evident that he performed his duty as a subordinate with even greater zeal than his duty as a commander. Thanks to the strictness and assiduity of its commander, the regiment, in comparison with others that had reached Braunau at the same time, was in splendid condition. There were only 217 sick and stragglers. Everything was in good order except the boots. Kutuzov walked through the ranks, sometimes stopping to say a few friendly words to officers he had known in the Turkish War, sometimes also to the soldiers. Looking at their boots, he several times shook his head sadly, pointing them out to the Austrian general with an expression which seemed to say that he was not blaming anyone, but could not help noticing what a bad state of things it was. The regimental commander ran forward on each such occasion, fearing to miss a single word of the commander-in-chief's regarding the regiment. Behind Kutuzov, at a distance that allowed every softly spoken word to be heard, followed some 20 men of his suite. These gentlemen talked among themselves, and sometimes laughed. Nearest of all to the commander-in-chief walked a handsome adjutant. This was Prince Bolkonsky. Beside him was his comrade Nesvitsky, a tall staff officer, extremely stout, with a kindly, smiling, handsome face and moist eyes. Nesvitsky could hardly keep from laughter provoked by a swarthy hussar officer who walked beside him. This hussar, with a grave face and without a smile or a change in the expression of his fixed eyes, watched the regimental commander's back and mimicked his every movement. Each time the commander started and bent forward, the hussar started and bent forward in exactly the same manner. Nesvitsky laughed and nudged the others to make them look at the flag. Kutuzov walked slowly and languidly past thousands of eyes, which were starting from their sockets to watch their chief. On reaching the 3rd company he suddenly stopped. His suite, not having expected this, involuntarily came closer to him. "Ah, Timokhin," said he, recognizing the red-nosed captain, who had been reprimanded on account of the blue greatcoat. One would have thought it impossible for a man to stretch himself more than Timokhin had done when he was reprimanded by the regimental commander, but now that the commander-in-chief addressed him he drew himself up to such an extent that it seemed he could not have sustained it had the commander-in-chief continued to look at him, and so Kutuzov, who evidently understood his case and wished him nothing but good, quickly turned away, a scarcely perceptible smile flitting over his scarred and puffy face. "Another Ismail comrade," said he, "a brave officer. Are you satisfied with him?" he asked the regimental commander, and the latter, unconscious that he was being reflected in the hussar officer as in a looking-glass, started, moved forward, and answered, "Highly satisfied, Your Excellency. We all have our weaknesses," said Kutuzov, smiling and walking away from him. He used to have a predilection for Bacchus. The regimental commander was afraid he may be blamed for this and did not answer. The hussar at that moment noticed the face of the red-nosed captain and his drawn-in stomach and mimicked his expression and pose with such exactitude that Nesvitsky could not help laughing. Kutuzov turned round. The officer evidently had complete control of his face, and while Kutuzov was turning managed to make a grimace and then assume a most serious, deferential, and innocent expression. The third company was the last, and Kutuzov pondered, apparently trying to recollect something. Prince Andrew stepped forward from among the suite and said in French, "You told me to remind you of the officer Dólokhov, reduced to the ranks in this regiment." "Where is Dólokhov?" asked Kutuzov. Dólokhov, who had already changed into a soldier's grey greatcoat, did not wait to be called. The shapely figure of the fair-haired soldier, with his clear blue eyes, stepped forward from the ranks, went up to the commander-in-chief, and presented arms. "Have you a complaint to make?" Kutuzov asked with a slight frown. "This is Dólokhov," said Prince Andrew. "Ah," said Kutuzov, "I hope this will be a lesson to you. Do your duty. The Emperor is gracious, and I shan't forget you if you deserve well." The clear blue eyes looked at the commander-in-chief just as boldly as they had looked at the regimental commander, seeming by their expression to tear open the veil of convention that separates a commander-in-chief so widely from a private. "One thing I ask of Your Excellency," Dólokhov said in his firm, ringing, deliberate voice. "I ask an opportunity to atone for my fault and prove my devotion to His Majesty the Emperor and to Russia." Kutuzov turned away. The same smile of the eyes with which he had turned from Captain Timokhin again flitted over his face. He turned away with a grimace as if to say that everything Dólokhov had said to him and everything he could say had long been known to him, that he was weary of it and it was not at all what he wanted. He turned away and went to the carriage. The regiment broke up into companies, which went to their appointed quarters near Braunau, where they hoped to receive boots and clothes and to rest after their hard marches. "You won't bear me a grudge, Prokhor Ignatitch," said the regimental commander, overtaking the third company on its way to its quarters, and riding up to Captain Timokhin, who was walking in front. The regimental commander's face now that the inspection was happily over beamed with irrepressible delight. "It's in the Emperor's service. It can't be helped. One is sometimes a bit hasty on parade. I am the first to apologize. You know me." He was very pleased, and he held out his hand to the captain. "Don't mention it, General, as if I'd be so bold," replied the captain, his nose growing redder as he gave a smile which showed where two front teeth were missing that had been knocked out by the butt end of a gun at Ismail. "And tell Mr. Dólokhov that I won't forget him. He may be quite easy. And tell me, please, I've been meaning to ask how is he behaving himself and in general. As far as the service goes he is quite punctilious, Your Excellency." "But his character," said Timokhin. "And what about his character?" asked the regimental commander. "It's different on different days," answered the captain. "One day he is sensible, well-educated, and good-natured, and the next he's a wild beast. In Poland, if you please, he nearly killed a Jew." "Oh, well, well," remarked the regimental commander. "Still, one must have pity on a young man in misfortune. You know he has important connections. Well, then, you just, I will, Your Excellency, said Timokhin, showing by his smile that he understood his commander's wish. Well, of course, of course. The regimental commander sought out Dólokhov in the ranks and, reining in his horse, said to him, after the next affair, epaulettes. Dólokhov looked round but did not say anything, nor did the mocking smile on his lips change. Well, that's all right, continued the regimental commander. A cup of vodka for the men from me, he added so that the soldiers could hear. I thank you all. God be praised. And he rode past that company and overtook the next one. Well, he's really a good fellow. One can serve under him, said Timokhin to the subaltern beside him. In a word, a hearty one, said the subaltern. Laughing, the regimental commander was nicknamed King of Hearts. The cheerful mood of their officers after the inspection infected the soldiers. The company marched on gaily. The soldiers' voices could be heard on every side, and they said Kutuzov was blind of one eye. And so he is, quite blind. No, friend, he is sharper-eyed than you are. Boots and leg bands, he noticed everything. When he looked at my feet, friend, well, thinks I, and that other one with him, the Austrian, looked as if he were smeared with chalk as white as flour. I suppose they polish him up as they do the guns. I say, Fedoshin, did he say when the battles are to begin? You were near him. Everybody said that Buonaparte himself was at Braunau. Buonaparte himself. Just listen to the fool. What he doesn't know. The Prussians are up in arms now. The Austrians, you see, are putting them down. When they've been put down, the war with Buonaparte will begin. And he says Buonaparte is in Braunau. Shows you're a fool. You'd better listen more carefully. What devils these quartermasters are. See, the 5th Company is turning into the village already. They will have their buckwheat cooked before we reach our quarters. Give me a biscuit, you devil. And did you give me tobacco yesterday? That's just it, friend. Ah, well, never mind, here you are. They may call a halt here or we'll have to do another 4 miles without eating. Wasn't it fine when those Germans gave us lifts? You just sit still and are drawn along. And here, friend, the people are quite beggarly. There they all seemed to be Poles, all under the Russian crown, but here they are all regular Germans. Singers to the front, came the captain's order, and from the different ranks some 20 men ran to the front. A drummer, their leader, turned round facing the singers and flourishing his arm, began a long drawn-out soldier's song commencing with the words, "Morning dawned, the sun was rising," and concluding, "On then, brothers, on to glory," led by Father Kamensky. This song had been composed in the Turkish campaign and now being sung in Austria, the only change being that the words Father Kamensky were replaced by Father Kutuzov, having jerked out these last words as soldiers do and waved his arms, as if flinging something to the ground. The drummer, a lean, handsome soldier of 40, looked sternly at the singers and screwed up his eyes. Then, having satisfied himself that all eyes were fixed on him, he raised both arms as if carefully lifting some invisible but precious object above his head and, holding it there for some seconds, suddenly flung it down and began, "Oh, my bower, oh, my bower, oh, my bower," new chimed in 20 voices, and the castanet player, in spite of the burden of his equipment, rushed out to the front, and, walking backwards before the company, jerked his shoulders and flourished his castanets as if threatening someone. The soldiers, swinging their arms and keeping time spontaneously, marched with long steps. Behind the company the sound of wheels, the creaking of springs, and the tramp of horses' hoofs were heard. Kutuzov and his suite were returning to the town. The commander-in-chief made a sign that the men should continue to march at ease, and he and all his suite showed pleasure at the sound of the singing and the sight of the dancing soldier and the gay and smartly marching men. In the second file, from the right flank, beside which the carriage passed the company, a blue-eyed soldier involuntarily attracted notice. It was Dólokhov, marching with particular grace and boldness in time to the song and looking at those driving past as if he pitied all who were not at that moment marching with the company. The hussar cornet of Kutuzov's suite, who had mimicked the regimental commander, fell back from the carriage and rode up to Dólokhov. Hussar Cornet Zhirkov had at one time, in Petersburg, belonged to the wild set led by Dólokhov. Zhirkov had met Dólokhov abroad as a private, and had not seen fit to recognize him. But now that Kutuzov had spoken to the gentleman ranker, he addressed him with the cordiality of an old friend. "My dear fellow, how are you?" said he through the singing, making his horse keep pace with the company. "How am I?" Dólokhov answered coldly. "I am as you see." The lively song gave a special flavor to the tone of free and easy gaiety with which Zhirkov spoke, and to the intentional coldness of Dólokhov's reply. "And how do you get on with the officers?" inquired Zhirkov. "All right. They are good fellows." "And how have you wriggled onto the staff?" "I was attached. I'm on duty." Both were silent. She let the hawk fly upward from her wide right sleeve, went the song, arousing an involuntary sensation of courage and cheerfulness. Their conversation would probably have been different but for the effect of that song. "Is it true that Austrians have been beaten?" asked Dólokhov. "The devil only knows. They say so." "I'm glad," answered Dólokhov briefly and clearly, as the song demanded. "I say, come round some evening and we'll have a game of faro," said Zhirkov. "Why, have you too much money? Do come." "I can't. I've sworn not to. I won't drink and won't play till I get reinstated." "Well, that's only till the first engagement. We shall see." They were again silent. "Come if you need anything. One can at least be of use on the staff." Dólokhov smiled. "Don't trouble. If I want anything, I won't beg, I'll take it." "Well, never mind. I only. Goodbye. Good health. It's a long, long way." Chapter 3. On returning from the review, Kutuzov took the Austrian general into his private room and, calling his adjutant, asked for some papers relating to the condition of the troops on their arrival, and the letters that had come from the Archduke Ferdinand, who was in command of the advanced army. Prince Andrew Bolkonsky came into the room with the required papers. Kutuzov and the Austrian member of the Hofkriegsrath were sitting at the table on which a plan was spread out. "Ah," said Kutuzov, glancing at Bolkonsky as if by this exclamation he was asking the adjutant to wait, and he went on with the conversation in French. "All I can say, General," said he with a pleasant elegance of expression and intonation that obliged one to listen to each deliberately spoken word. It was evident that Kutuzov himself listened with pleasure to his own voice. "All I can say, General, is that if the matter depended on my personal wishes, the will of His Majesty the Emperor Francis would have been fulfilled long ago. I should long ago have joined the Archduke. And believe me on my honor that to me personally it would be a pleasure to hand over the supreme command of the army into the hands of a better informed and more skillful general, of whom Austria has so many, and to lay down all this heavy responsibility. But circumstances are sometimes too strong for us, General." And Kutuzov smiled in a way that seemed to say, "You are quite at liberty not to believe me, and I don't even care whether you do or not, but you have no grounds for telling me so. And that is the whole point." The Austrian general looked dissatisfied, but had no option but to reply in the same tone. "On the contrary," he said, in a querulous and angry tone that contrasted with his flattering words, "on the contrary, your Excellency's participation in the common action is highly valued by His Majesty, but we think the present delay is depriving the splendid Russian troops and their commander of the laurels they have been accustomed to win in their battles." He concluded his evidently prearranged sentence Kutuzov bowed with the same smile. But that is my conviction, and judging by the last letter with which His Highness the Archduke Ferdinand has honored me, I imagine that the Austrian troops, under the direction of so skillful a leader as General Mack, have by now already gained a decisive victory and no longer need our aid, said Kutuzov. The general frowned. Though there was no definite news of an Austrian defeat, there were many circumstances confirming the unfavorable rumors that were afloat, and so Kutuzov's suggestion of an Austrian victory sounded much like irony. But Kutuzov went on blandly smiling with the same expression, which seemed to say that he had a right to suppose so, and, in fact, the last letter he had received from Mack's army informed him of a victory and stated strategically the position of the army was very favorable. Give me that letter, said Kutuzov, turning to Prince Andrew. Please have a look at it, and Kutuzov, with an ironical smile about the corners of his mouth, read to the Austrian general the following passage, in German, from the Archduke Ferdinand's letter. We have fully concentrated forces of nearly 70,000 men with which to attack and defeat the enemy should he cross the Lech. Also, as we are masters of Ulm, we cannot be deprived of the advantage of commanding both sides of the Danube, so that should the enemy not cross the Lech, we can cross the Danube, throw ourselves on his line of communications, recross the river lower down, and frustrate his intention should he try to direct his whole force against our faithful ally. We shall therefore confidently await the moment when the Imperial Russian army will be fully equipped, and shall then, in conjunction with it, easily find a way to prepare for the enemy the fate he deserves. Kutuzov sighed deeply on finishing this paragraph, and looked at the member of the Hofkriegsrath mildly and attentively. But you know the wise maxim, Your Excellency, advising one to expect the worst, said the Austrian general, evidently wishing to have done with jests and to come to business. He involuntarily looked round at the aide-de-camp. Excuse me, General, interrupted Kutuzov, also turning to Prince Andrew. Look here, my dear fellow, get from Kozlovsky all the reports from our scouts. Here are 2 letters from Count Nostitz, and here is one from His Highness the Archduke Ferdinand, and here are these, he said, handing him several papers. Make a neat memorandum in French out of all this, showing all the news we have had of the movements of the Austrian army, and then give it to His Excellency. Prince Andrew bowed his head in token of having understood from the first not only what had been said, but also what Kutuzov would have liked to tell him. He gathered up the papers and with a bow to both, stepped softly over the carpet and went out into the waiting room. Though not much time had passed since Prince Andrew had left Russia, he had changed greatly during that period, in the expression of his face, in his movements, in his walk. Scarcely a trace was left of his former affected languor and indolence. He now looked like a man who has time to think of the impression he makes on others, but is occupied with agreeable and interesting work. His face expressed more satisfaction with himself and those around him. His smile and glance were brighter and more attractive. Kutuzov, whom he had overtaken in Poland, had received him very kindly, promised not to forget him, distinguished him above the other adjutants, and had taken him to Vienna and given him the more serious commissions. From Vienna Kutuzov wrote to his old comrade, Prince Andrew's father. Your son bids fair to become an officer distinguished by his industry, firmness, and expedition. I consider myself fortunate to have such a subordinate by me. On Kutuzov's staff, among his fellow officers and in the army generally, Prince Andrew had, as he had had in Petersburg society, 2 quite opposite reputations. Some, a minority, acknowledged him to be different from themselves and from everyone else, expected great things of him, listened to him, admired and imitated him, and with them Prince Andrew was natural and pleasant. Others, the majority, disliked him and considered him conceited, cold, and disagreeable. But among these people, Prince Andrew knew how to take his stand so that they respected and evening feared him. Coming out of Kutuzov's room into the waiting room with the papers in his hand, Prince Andrew came up to his comrade, the aide-de-camp on duty, Kozlovsky, who was sitting at the window with a book. "Well, Prince," asked Kozlovsky, "I'm ordered to write a memorandum explaining why we are not advancing." "And why is it?" Prince Andrew shrugged his shoulders. "Any news from Mac?" "No. If it were true that he has been beaten, news would have come." "Probably," said Prince Andrew, moving toward the outer door. But at that instant a tall Austrian general in a greatcoat, with the Order of Maria Theresa on his neck and a black bandage round his head, who had evidently just arrived, entered quickly, slamming the door. Prince Andrew stopped short. "Commander-in-Chief Kutuzov," said the newly arrived general, speaking quickly with a harsh German accent, looking to both sides and advancing straight toward the inner door. "The commander-in-chief is engaged," said Kozlovsky, going hurriedly up to the unknown general and blocking his way to the door. "Whom shall I announce?" The unknown general looked disdainfully down at Kozlovsky, who was rather short, as if surprised that anyone should not know him. "The commander-in-chief is engaged," repeated Kozlovsky calmly. The general's face clouded, his lips quivered and trembled. He took out a notebook, hurriedly scribbled something in pencil, tore out the leaf, gave it to Kozlovsky, stepped quickly to the window, and threw himself into a chair, gazing at those in the room as if asking, "Why do they look at me?" Then he lifted his head, stretched his neck as if he intended to say something, but immediately, with affected indifference, began to hum to himself, producing a queer sound which immediately broke off. The door of the private room opened, and Kutuzov appeared in the doorway. The general, with the bandaged head, bent forward as though running away from some danger, and making long, quick strides with his thin legs, went up to Kutuzov. "Vous voyez le malheureux Mac," he uttered in a broken voice. Kutuzov's face, as he stood in the open doorway, remained perfectly immobile for a few moments. Then wrinkles ran over his face like a wave, and his forehead became smooth again. He bowed his head respectfully, closed his eyes, silently let Mac enter his room before him, and closed the door himself behind him. The report, which had been circulated that the Austrians had been beaten, and that the whole army had surrendered at Ulm, proved to be correct. Within half an hour adjutants had been sent in various directions with orders which showed that the Russian troops, who had hitherto been inactive, would also soon have to meet the enemy. Prince Andrew was one of those rare staff officers whose chief interests lay in the general progress of the war. When he saw Mac and heard the details of his disaster, he understood that half the campaign was lost, understood all the difficulties of the Russian army's position, and vividly imagined what awaited it and the part he would have to play. Involuntarily he felt a joyful agitation at the thought of the humiliation of arrogant Austria, and that in a week's time he may, perhaps, seen and take part in the first Russian encounter with the French since Suvorov met them. He feared that Bonaparte's genius may outweigh all the courage of the Russian troops, and at the same time could not admit the idea of his hero being disgraced. Excited and irritated by these thoughts, Prince Andrew went toward his room to write to his father, to whom he wrote every day. In the corridor, he met Nesvitsky, with whom he shared a room, and the wag Zherkov. They were as usual laughing. "Why are you so glum?" asked Nesvitsky, noticing Prince Andrew's pale face and glittering eyes. "There's nothing to be gay about," answered Bolkonsky. Just as Prince Andrew met Nesvitsky and Zherkov, there came toward them, from the other end of the corridor, Strach, an Austrian general who on Kutuzov's staff in charge of the provisioning of the Russian army, and the member of the Hofkriegsrath who had arrived the previous evening. There was room enough in the wide corridor for the generals to pass the three officers quite easily, but Zherkov, pushing Nesvitsky aside with his arm, said in a breathless voice, "They're coming. They're coming. Stand aside. Make way, please. Make way." The generals were passing by, looking as if they wished to avoid embarrassing attentions. On the face of the wag Zherkov there suddenly appeared a stupid smile of glee, which he seemed unable to suppress. "Your Excellency," said he in German, stepping forward and addressing the Austrian general, "I have the honor to congratulate you." He bowed his head and scraped first with one foot and then with the other, awkwardly, like a child at a dancing lesson. The member of the Hofkriegsrath looked at him severely, but, seeing the seriousness of his stupid smile, could not but give him a moment's attention. He screwed up his eyes, showing that he was listening. "I have the honor to congratulate you. General Mack has arrived quite well, only a little bruised just here," he added, pointing with a beaming smile to his head. The general frowned, turned away, and went on. "Gott, why naive?" Said he angrily, after he had gone a few steps. Good God, what simplicity! Nesvitsky with a laugh threw his arms round Prince Andrew, but Bolkonsky, turning still paler, pushed him away with an angry look and turned to Zherkov. The nervous irritation aroused by the appearance of Mack, the news of his defeat, and the thought of what lay before the Russian army found vent in anger at Zherkov's untimely jest. "If you, sir, choose to make a buffoon of yourself," he said sharply, with a slight trembling of the lower jaw, "I can't prevent your doing so, but I warn you that if you dare to play the fool in my presence, I will teach you to behave yourself." Nesvitsky and Zherkov were so surprised by this outburst that they gazed at Bolkonsky silently with wide-open eyes. "What's the matter?" "I only congratulated them," said Zherkov. "I am not jesting with you. Please be silent," cried Bolkonsky, and taking Nesvitsky's arm he left Zherkov, who did not know what to say. "Come, what's the matter, old fellow?" said Nesvitsky, trying to soothe him. "What's the matter?" exclaimed Prince Andrew, standing still in his excitement. "Don't you understand that either we are officers serving our Tsar and our country, rejoicing in the successes and grieving at the misfortunes of our common cause, or we are merely lackeys who care nothing for their master's business? Pourante mille hommes massacres et l'armée de nos alliés détruite, et vous trouvez l'aliment pour rire, asterisk," he said, as if strengthening his views by this French sentence. "C'est bien pour un garçon de rien comme cet individu dont vous avez fait un ami, mais passe pour vous, asterisk too." Only a hobbledehoy could amuse himself in this way, he added in Russian, but pronouncing the word with a French accent, having noticed that Zherkov could still hear him.